It took place in a world unlike any other, on a land called Terranor. According to the prophecy, a super being was to appear from another world when the Emperor's heart was burned. The ruler of Luslanad sacrificed many of his children and confidants to fulfill this prophecy. When the sacrifice was made, an earthly child appeared before the Emperor. The Emperor was angry, seeing before him a 10-year-old boy instead of the most powerful creature, control over whom would give incredible power. The boy did not understand where he was. He was confused and scared, but the Emperor did not care about him, and he ordered the child to be removed from sight. Summoned again to another world, Laxland Palace was shaken by blows of unprecedented force. Its walls and ceiling were covered with cracks and stained with the blood of men and monsters. Emperor Luslanad used his last strength to summon a new powerful creature into his world to protect himself from the inexorable threat. A giant snake with spikes around its head and fangs the size of a human leg wriggled in the center of the hall, shielding Luslanad from the approaching knight. Not a muscle moved on the knight's face. His cloak flew into the air, and he grabbed his sword, preparing to strike. The knight swung his sword, and blue discharges danced around him, indicating that he was using some powerful magic. These were two techniques at once, conquering the heavens and rumbling the mountains, which dealt a blow of colossal force to the snake, knocking it to the ground and tearing it into pieces. The Emperor realized that he had nothing to counter the attacker with, since the knight had destroyed all the creatures and was not even out of breath. The knight approached the steps in front of the throne and said that the power of the Emperor's monsters came from the fact that they were from another world. His face expressed indignation, mixed with impatience to fulfill what had long been planned. It turned out to be a young guy who seemed familiar to Luslanad. The knight decided to give a hint and shouted out that he was also summoned from another world. It was Song Shi Han, the unearthly savior. Everything in this room, both the knight and the monster parts scattered around the room, were the result of the Laxland family's special ability to open portals to other worlds. Shi-Han came closer and closer to the king sitting on the ground, accusing him of tyranny, of many deaths and human suffering. But also because of Luslanad, Shi-Khan himself suffered, in whom the emperor bitterly recognized the very boy he had neglected, a boy who was thrown into prison for no reason and spent many years there with no hope for any future. The emperor knew that 3 years ago, that boy had escaped from prison with the help of a certain magician who had caused great destruction. Shi-Han admitted that he had been dreaming of revenge every day for years, and now the time for payback had come. The boy's eyes flashed with anger, and he raised his sword, engulfed in blue discharges, to strike, wanting to put all his pain into this blow. The pain of years lost in captivity, the pain of injustice and the loss of friends who died due to the fault of Luslanad. The emperor only clenched his teeth, feeling that these were his last moments, but there was no remorse in them, only anger. He only had time to shout out as he cursed the prophecy that had so cruelly failed him. At that moment, Shi-Han's sword cut through Luslanad's chest and he collapsed onto the wall he was sitting near. The owner of the powerful gift of summoning creatures from other worlds was now dead, blood pouring from his mouth, staining his white fur collar. Shi-Han looked at the defeated enemy, and a hard expression remained on his face, as if he didn't believe that everything was really over. With a habitual movement, he hid the sword in its sheath, preparing to leave this gloomy place. The boy took one last look at the dead emperor and said to himself that it was finally all over. Finally, Shi-Han closed his eyes and breathed a sigh of relief as the fury of the fight slowly began to leave him. Then he heard approaching footsteps, and a clear girl's voice called his name. The guy turned around with joy and called out to the girl in response, because it was his beloved Lavina. Her face, framed by silver hair, radiated joy and perhaps even delight, and she approached, waving her hand. She congratulated Shi-Han on his victory, and at that moment, Lavina, with her silver hair and radiant smile, seemed like the most beautiful creature in the world. The boy and the girl approached each other, and Shi-Han replied to Lavina that this victory did not come easy for him. He hugged her, pressing her to himself, because the warmth of his loved one was more necessary to him than ever. Shi-Han whispered in his friend's ear that everything would be fine now, and he would finally be able to do everything to make her happy. Lavina moved away from the guy slightly, and, looking into his eyes, addressed him by name, as if she had started to say something, but stopped. A familiar voice came from behind Shi-Han, saying that there was still one important matter left, because the emperor's heart needed to be burned. It was the magician. He noted with satisfaction that Shi-Han had exceeded his expectations, and that he did not believe that Shi-Han would succeed in such a difficult task. Shi-Han was surprised to see his comrade, the mage Lilstein, appear here right after the massacre. But Lilstein was not alone. Just then, his other 4 comrades arrived to help him carry out the plan. They debated whether Shihan would disappear if the emperor's heart were burned, and how ironic it was that the king, in an attempt to gain power, had brought about his own death. Shihan was even a little outraged that they were talking so easily about the fact that he could now disappear from this world, and they would no longer be able to see him. At this time, Lavina put her hand on his shoulder and asked him earnestly if he really didn't want to get home to Earth, from where he had been mercilessly kidnapped. Shihan looked at his friends with a smile and replied that he had finally decided to stay. He said that all the people closest to him, both living and already dead, are here in this world. Lilstein, who had already lit a fire to perform the cremation, turned around as he listened to Shihan's speech. The guy added that his loved one was also in this world, and at these words Lavina's cheeks turned red. Shihan admitted that of course he misses Earth, but this world has already become much more familiar and closer to him than his former homeland. The guy clenched his fist in emotion and pressed it to the armor in the area of his heart, waiting for his friends to react to this joyful news. However, they did not show any violent reaction. Some stood with a blank expression on their faces, some smiled softly, and some had a mocking expression. Lilstein, smiling slyly, asked whether it was true that Shihan was unlikely to change his mind. He confidently and loudly confirmed the firmness and finality of his intentions. Lavina called out to Shihan, and he heard emotions in her voice that he didn't understand. She gently placed her hands on his shoulders and kissed him, which made even such a seasoned warrior feel embarrassed. He turned to her in confusion, trying to find out what she was not saying, but Lavina only continued to smile tenderly. A hard smile played on her lips, and she said that things had become more complicated. Shihan began to feel something was wrong with him. He didn't recognize Lavina and wondered what had caused such a sudden change. Suddenly, a portal opened behind him, and from the blue discharges it was obvious that it was a portal to another world. Shihan looked around, trying to get his bearings. Something strange was happening that he couldn't have foreseen. There were vague silhouettes looming in the dimensional portal. Shihan wondered how it could open when Lustlanad was already dead. He shouted a warning to his friends so that they could look around and react in time to the unknown threat. But a second later, a chill ran down Shihan's spine, and he looked at his friends. They stood motionless, completely calm, as if they all understood perfectly well what was happening. In Lilstein's hand, and in the depths of the flames, something dark was visible, something that had recently been alive. Shihan asked if this was the Emperor's heart, but even without an answer, he knew that it was. The boy listened in horror to Lilstein's words, who explained that even the death of the entire Laxland clan left one opportunity to open the portal, and that was the heart. Lilstein held the source of the final portal in front of him at arm's length, flesh gradually turning to ash. The magician coldly said that Shihan had become too powerful. Others added that, in addition to his power, he has too much popular love and popularity. They didn't want Shihan to gain power and become stronger than all of them, to become some kind of new emperor. So they thanked Shihan for saving the world from tyranny, but left him no choice and concluded that he must go back to his world. Shihan couldn't believe his ears because his friends, the people he wasn't afraid to turn his back on, turned out to be the ones who took advantage of him. He turned to his beloved Lavina, expecting help from her. She remained his last hope when everything was collapsing before his eyes. But his cry went unanswered. Shihan looked at the girl, and she only looked at him and did not move. Lavina whispered his name, and he realized that she was in league with the others, and Shihan had no allies left. The girl continued to smile kindly, which was in stark contrast to her cold voice, which said that Shihan should leave on his own. Shihan cried out in despair. He was not going to just give up when it seemed like everything was finally going to be okay. Lavina admitted that she dreams of power and intends to subjugate men who will shade her greatness. But she doesn't agree to a supporting role, where she should simply be the companion of the great Shihan. Lavina condescendingly ran her finger along Shihan's chin and said with slight regret that Shihan was not fit to be her favorite. Shihan began to fall into the blue glow. He called out to Lavina and wanted an explanation from her. The girl jokingly remarked that she would help him cope with the pain he was now experiencing. And with these words, she pushed him in the chest, helping the portal to pull the knight inside itself. Shihan fell into the hole, moving away, and Lavina shouted after him to come back. And a second later, she added sarcastically that he should return to his home, and her figure with the silhouettes of the other traitors began to move away. Shihan could no longer do anything, and could only scream helplessly as he flew through the void between the worlds. The blue glow flickered and became cloudy. Nothing could be seen in it anymore, and the portal began to slam shut. Just another moment and one final discharge collapsed the passage, raising clouds of dust from the dirty floor of the castle, over the lands of Terranor, as if proclaiming the coming of a new bright era for the inhabitants of the Empire. The prophecy came true. The great warrior killed the tyrant, and his allies proclaimed the good news to the people from the balcony of the castle. Lilstein declared the beginning of the reign of 6 emperors, each of whom was to rule his own part of the empire in order to prevent a new tyranny. The crowd rejoiced, welcoming the saviors, not even realizing that the famous hero Shi Han was not at the celebration by his own will. A glorious time had come when the people of Terranor could breathe a sigh of relief, free from strife and the oppression of exorbitant taxes. This went on for a long time, year after year, until one day in the world of Terranor, a portal opened again. It was a fine summer day, and snow-white clouds floated across the sky, contrasting with the dark green of the nearby mountain range. Hidden among the sparsely standing trees is a small, well-kept hut with a small vegetable garden next to it. The door of the hut opened, and a clear girl's voice was heard. A girl with light hair braided with a dark blue ribbon came out of the house. She was humming a song and carrying a basket in her hands. The girl was enjoying the weather. She seemed to be in a great mood and was going to work hard. The bright sun blinded her through the treetops, but the girl only covered herself with her hand and walked towards the garden, carrying a hand hoe and a basket. Not even a minute had passed before the hoe had already sunk into the ground, and the work was in full swing. The garden would soon be brought into complete order. The girl continued to hum the song, happily caring for her plants. Suddenly, some vague sound attracted her attention, and she stopped working and listened to understand what it was. Suddenly, a fish splashed into the garden a few meters from the girl. It seemed as if it had fallen from the sky. The girl approached in bewilderment and began to examine the fish that appeared out of nowhere. The fish turned out to be flounder, and the girl was even happy, since this fish is very tasty, which meant that she was in for an unexpectedly pleasant dinner. But then she thought that perhaps the intention to eat fish that came from nowhere was reckless and even dangerous. The girl put the fish aside and decided to finish her work first and then deal with this mystery. At that moment, something large crashed down behind the girl after the fish, raising a real column of dust and scattering the earth in all directions. The girl turned around in fear, assessing the damage inflicted on her plants by the unknown projectile. Coming closer, she saw that there was a whole pig lying in the garden, leaving a whole crater under itself when it fell. The girl looked at the sky in fear, realizing that uninvited gifts were falling from there, and expecting a new surprise. The surprise did not take long to come, and the girl's eyes widened in an attempt to examine the next object, which was already rapidly approaching. It looked like it was a man, or rather a dark-haired guy, who had pulled some of the steam from the clouds with him, so that a misty trail was now trailing behind him. The guy was bawling, looking at the ground and clearly not wanting to meet her in this way. At this point, the girl realized that the falling man was naked, and the situation suddenly became even more awkward. The guy fell to the ground, raising such a cloud of dust that it took a while for it to settle and for anything to become visible. The shocked girl did not dare to do anything in such extraordinary circumstances when, behind the clouds of dust, she saw a body sticking out of the ground. The boy stuck his head into the ground and stood almost like an ostrich, except that he was featherless. But then he pulled his head out of the ground and shook it to come to his senses after such a hard landing. The stranger looked around in confusion, trying to figure out where he was. He saw the mountain range, the grove of trees surrounding the hut, the weeds outside the vegetable garden, and seemed to be looking for familiar landmarks. Then he turned to the hut and began to examine the yard, where there were carts with barrels and a neat stone well. The girl, still holding the hoe, approached and timidly greeted the uninvited guest. But the guy didn't pay attention to her. A smile played on his face. It seemed he was very pleased with something. He jumped up joyfully and laughed, and then shouted that he had achieved what he had been waiting for many years. The boy raised his hands in triumph and shouted, addressing someone and announcing that he was back. His laughter was interrupted by weakness. The stranger bent over and then began to fall. Not even a couple of seconds had passed, and he was already lying unconscious in the middle of the garden, which was natural after such a loud arrival. The girl stood nearby, surrounded by clouds of dust that had not yet cleared, and thought about the fact that she was clearly not destined to dig in the garden today. Evening came, and the hut in the middle of the grove was plunged into darkness, but its windows glowed with warm living lights. The guy opened his eyes and found himself lying on a clean bed and covered with a sheet. He turned his head, looking around the room. Next to the bed there was a nightstand with a table lamp and a beautiful clock. This place looked very cozy. The guy asked himself where he was and tried to remember the latest events. Then a beautiful blonde girl came up to him with a tray and noticed that he had already woken up. The girl showed the alien the porridge prepared especially for him and asked how he felt. The stranger rose with difficulty and realized that he was naked under the sheet, and then thought with shame that he could hardly have gotten to the bed on his own. The guy began to massage his shoulder. He was in pain and lamented that the side effects of his appearance had had too strong an effect on him. Meanwhile, the girl wondered who was in front of her, because the guest used a strange dialect, but did not look like a native of the provinces. Meanwhile, the boy raised his head, his face cleared, and he said with relief that he remembered that he was no longer on Earth. The stranger asked the girl if she really had helped him and brought him here, and she, having answered in the affirmative, finally came up and put the tray on the nightstand. The guy asked him directly where he was, and the girl finally discarded the idea that he was from some tribe. She named the nearest landmarks, Mount Defilan, the village of Goran, but this meant nothing to the stranger. Then, assuming that the person in front of her was a foreigner, the girl replied that they were on the territory of the Lilstein Empire. The boy whispered her words about the Lilstein Empire under his breath, and a predatory expression appeared on his face. He folded his hands in thought, muttering about Lilstein becoming emperor, and seasoned his thoughts with an insult. At this point, both of them felt awkward, as the guy looked comical, sitting on the bed in such a pose, as if he was planning something grandiose. He came to his senses and modestly asked the hostess of the house for some clothes so that they wouldn't be embarrassed. A short time later, a stack of empty bowls stood on the dining table located on the first floor of the house. The alien was wolfing down the food. Apparently, he really liked the girl's dish. Or he was just really hungry. The only thing that bothered him was the fishy smell. But he was not picky, believing that some earthly comforts might not be available in this world. The guy was still happy to be back, and he also sincerely thanked the hospitable girl for the generous treat. She continued to look at the guest with excitement, studying literally every centimeter of his body and the slightest trait of behavior. She noted his excellent physical fitness, as well as his confidence, bordering on unceremoniousness, which spoke of the difficult origins of this man. Everything suggested that he might be an aristocrat, but it was unclear how that could be combined with falling from the sky naked. The guy, showing manners, apologized for never asking the girl her name, but now wants to correct this oversight. The girl introduced herself. Her name was Alida, and she did housework like an ordinary village girl. But the guy suddenly asked what relation she had to swordsmen then, since she seemed to him to be quite experienced. Alida froze in bewilderment at how he was able to figure her out without really seeing anything, and having only recently arrived here. She carefully asked the stranger where he got such an idea, but he answered evasively that it just seemed that way to him. Alida decided to be frank in the hopes that it would help to learn more about the guest himself, and confirmed that she was a free swordsman, like a mercenary. But the guy, satisfied with the answer, only raised the stakes and said that he had another question. He asked what Alida was to Emperor Lustlanad, and a good-natured smile froze on her face. Before the guy could blink, there was a sudden movement and something big flew towards him. Alida flipped the table over in a flash, throwing it at the stranger, sending him and his plates and mugs to the floor. At the same time, Alida jumped to her feet, preparing for battle. Out of nowhere, a knife appeared in her hand and there was an expression of determination on her face. She jumped over the table, which was lying on its side, ready to pin her opponent to the ground and make him unable to move. But the guy disappeared so suddenly, as if he had evaporated, and Alida had to find out where he had gone. There were only shards of broken clay bowls lying on the floor, and no traces where the stranger could have slipped away. She heard his voice behind her. He noted that he had not intended to fight her. Alida stabbed him with a spinning motion, becoming increasingly convinced that the unexpected guest could pose a greater threat. But her blow hit nothing, causing her to stagger awkwardly and fly forward a few steps by inertia. Alida assumed a fighting stance again, continuing to analyze, and came to the conclusion that the stranger was probably a swordsman as well. She delivered another deft blow, but the guy was able to avoid it by bending slightly. He didn't even try to attack back and, continuing to dodge a whole series of blows from Alida, exclaimed that he just wanted to talk. Alida appreciated her opponent's skill, seeing that he was handling her attacks flawlessly. She decided to use a last resort and employ techniques she rarely used, striking diagonally as if drawing an invisible grid. The guy smiled contentedly and praised how Alida skillfully hid her fighting talents. He backed away, ignoring the flurry of knife swings, noticing that he could only see her aiming for his shoulders. The guest confidently stated that she was not trying to kill him and made a move that caused the knife to get stuck in the wooden spoon he was holding in his hand. This move was something of an insult to Alida when her truly dangerous attack was stopped in such a ridiculous way. She fell to the floor, thrown back by this unexpectedly powerful answer, and dropped the knife from her hands. Lying on the floor, Alita looked up at the stranger, and he handed her a spoon covered in tongues of orange glow that rose up her hand. It was some kind of unknown powerful technique, and Alita realized that there was no point in fighting any further, so she directly asked the guy who he was. The guest finally introduced himself. He stated that his name was Song Shi-han, and that he came to this world from Earth. Alita felt as if she had been struck by electricity. In front of her stood the legendary Sun Shu Khan himself, who had once been summoned to this world through a portal because of a prophecy. She asked again if the guy was really the savior from another world, and the guy responded with satisfaction, glad that he was still remembered. Shihan said he understood why Alita had lashed out at him, as the suspicion of being related to Laslanad could be offensive, but it was not a hint. Alita interrupted him and only said that she was Alathir Bella Luslanad, Lusklin, and then she added, so that there would be no doubt, that she was the daughter of the late emperor. After the death of the emperor, angry crowds with torches pursued everyone who had any kinship with Luslanad and sought to exterminate them. Alita would always remember that evening when the fire blazed in the castle, and her mother Serafina pressed her daughter to her chest in the back room, hiding from the rebels. The mother entrusted the family bodyguard Kiran to take care of Alita, realizing that this would put him in great danger. Kiran was loyal to the Imperial family and did not hesitate to take responsibility for the girl, and perhaps the reason was even more than loyalty. The bodyguard made a promise to Serafina to protect Alita at any cost, bitterly realizing that by doing so, he would have to leave Serafina herself unprotected. Alita did not understand what would happen next, but she felt that she would have to part with her mother, and so she cried bitterly. Years have passed since that terrible evening, and Kiran raised the girl as his own daughter, settling with her in the wilderness and teaching her to fight so that she could protect herself. However, despite all precautions, they were found, and the soldiers of the new emperor killed Kiran, and Alita was able to escape again. She maintained a hermit lifestyle, occasionally taking up mercenary work to earn a living. Shihan listened to her story, sipping from his mug and nodding in understanding, trying to sympathize with the girl who had suffered so many misfortunes. However, he asked if since he killed her father, Alita should feel hostility towards him, but she replied that she no longer associated herself with her father. Alita explained her attack by saying that the person who learned of her relationship with the late emperor was most likely an assassin. Shihang muttered with displeasure that his former allies might ask him if he agreed to kill the entire Imperial family. And then, in a conceited tone, he declared that Alita had nothing to fear now, because a wonderful man like him had fallen from the sky onto her. Alita had that feeling when someone does something and she feels ashamed, so she called out to Shihan to change the topic. The girl asked if he was really Song Shihan. How did he manage to return from another world here to Terranor? Someone must have summoned him. And as if by chance, she added a question about why he was traveling naked, and Shihan blushed and accidentally squeezed the mug so hard that its handle flew off. He replied in an offended tone that he did not control the laws of the portals, and that only living matter could pass through them. He said that he got here the same way the first time, and then, when he returned to Earth, he found himself naked in the crowded Quan Huaman Square. It was clear that the memories made Shihan feel shy, and Alita silently wondered about the meaning of Quan Huamun's strange words. She decided to bring the conversation back to the previous topic, and asked again who had summoned Shihan to Terranor 10 years after returning to Earth. To which Shihan replied that he had returned on his own, without the help of the Emperor's relatives. Alita was shocked once again by what else this extraordinary man was capable of. She only asked how he managed it. Shihan replied that it was not an easy task, and it took those 10 years in his home world to solve it. And to be honest, someone did help him. Here he paused mid-sentence and listened, although there was silence all around, and one could only hear the evening chirping of the cicadas in the yard. Shihan turned around and looked at the grove through the window. The sudden silence frightened Alita, and she asked what was the matter. The guy turned to Alita and paused. It seemed like he didn't dare answer right away because something was bothering him. He rose from his chair and asked if the girl really still lived there just so that she could not be found, and she confirmed this. Shihan cursed and said with a mixture of disappointment and shame that he had made a mistake in coming here. Alita was still confused, and he continued, explaining that in order to open the portal, he needed someone to act as a summoner. He added that since Alita was the closest relative, she was perfect for the role, and the girl's eyes opened wide. It dawned on her why he had immediately asked her about her relationship with Luslanad, and Shihan had confirmed that she was his way of returning here. But that wasn't all, because Shihan tensed up and began to explain that this had caused unforeseen consequences. The opening of the portal is noticeable to mages, meaning they will sense where it happened, discover Alita's home, and see that she used magic. Alita was surprised because she did not have magic and tried to assess what this threatened her with. She jumped up decisively from the table, which they had put back in place so that they could have a normal conversation. The girl peered intently through the window into the darkness, expecting to notice the movement of the uninvited guests. There were lights visible among the trees. Someone was approaching, and there were a lot of them. Alita was stunned by how quickly they got here. Knights in full plate armor with pikes and torches walked through the forest. Such detachments are not sent for simple villagers. The soldiers were about 100 meters from the hut, and, as they approached, they were assessing how to cordon off the house so as not to leave those inside a chance to escape. The sorcerer who was walking with the detachment reported to the commander that the source of the magical phenomenon was located right here. The commander's name was Zeno. He looked young with freckles covering his nose and cheekbones, but his sternness made one forget about this deceptive impression. Zenon briefly thanked the clan sorcerer and began giving orders to his subordinates. The knights were to surround the house, and Zeno distributed them into positions. Shihan, who had been watching the enemy's preparations through the window with interest until now, turned around and let out a surprised cry. Alita had managed to put on a protective leather suit, which replaced her armor due to the lack of money for expensive armor, and she was already holding a sword in her hand. Shihan noted to himself the lack of doubt and timidity in the girl's behavior, thinking that it was as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire previous life. He was afraid that she now hated him, since his short-sighted choice had revealed Alita's location, and now she was in great danger. Alita really thought and asked her not to remain silent if she wanted to tell him something. The girl responded, but at first she didn't understand what he wanted to hear, so she thought for a few seconds. But then she responded completely unexpectedly, thanking him for the timely warning that gave her the opportunity to prepare. This was not what Shihan expected at all, so he felt ashamed again, as if he had been an admonishing parent who had beaten a thank you out of her. Shouts were heard in the street. The knights demanded that the owner of the hut come outside, threatening to destroy the dwelling otherwise. Zeno gave the order to the sorcerer to frighten the inhabitants of the house with some not very powerful spell so that they would understand the seriousness of his intentions. The sorcerer, with the pleasure characteristic of a master of his craft, began to cast a spell, calling forth whirlwinds of flame around his hands. It was the burning pike technique. Fire burst out from the sorcerer's palms and engulfed the hut in a fiery tornado rising tens of meters in height. Zeno did not approve of the wizard's choice. Perhaps this was the intention, to make the spell seem dangerous. But if it really was, it was too much. The knight reminded the sorcerer that they had to deliver the girl alive, to which he assured that the spell would not harm those inside. And he muttered under his breath that, at worst, there would be a few burns left, watching as the soldiers cautiously approached the fire. Suddenly, the door of the burning house swung open and Alita quickly jumped out of it, slipping through the loose formation of knights. But the ring was not the only one, and the soldiers standing in reserve rushed to intercept her, encouraged by the promised reward. Alita began her battle dance, delivering devastating blows, knocking over soldiers and causing them to become confused. The knights did not expect such fierce resistance, and a murmur went through them that they were fighting a swordsman. Despite her skill, Alita was in dire straits. Too many enemies were pressing on her, and she was looking for a way to slip out of the unequal fight. There was a moment's pause in the battle, and she turned to see what it was. A blue flash flashed nearby and a powerful blow threw the girl to the ground. She immediately returned to her stance and saw that the source of the flash was the magic sword in Zeno's hands, which had pierced the ground where she was standing. Zeno was indignant that Alita dared to attack the soldiers, being much superior in her capabilities. The blue glow around the sword seemed to pour out his anger. Alita saw that in front of her was an enemy in magical armor and a head stronger than her. This did not bode well. Zeno dealt her a powerful blow, and the girl was thrown to the ground again. Alita realized that in this fight, she needed to dodge to have any chance. But she didn't intend to give the initiative completely to the enemy, so she struck back with her sword. However, this only resulted in the magical armor flashing blue and the blow returning back to her, causing great pain. The knight commander triumphantly declared that although Alita had a high-level sword, Zenon's armor was superior to his. He struck again, and although Alita was able to block the enemy's strike, it did not go unnoticed. The girl felt a sharp pain and screamed helplessly. It was unclear where the blood spurted from. Unable to resist, Alita flew back, dropping her sword, It looked like she had lost this fight. Zeno looked at her with a hard gaze, saying that this would happen to anyone who raised a hand against the Imperial Knights. The dust raised by the fight made the commander cough. Alita waited to be grabbed and taken away in an unknown direction. The girl felt that it seemed like her shoulder was broken. Zeno suggested that she stop resisting and was about to promise decent treatment. But Alita herself admitted defeat and raised her healthy hand up, saying that she surrendered. Zeno was glad that everything was over and began to say that Alita should go with the squad. However, at this point, a loud and even slightly impudent call was heard behind Zeno's back, which was addressed specifically to the commander. There stood a guy without weapons or armor, wearing a simple linen shirt, and he reproached Zeno for somehow quickly changing his anger to mercy. The commander was taken aback by such impudence, while at the same time being at a loss as to how to understand it. This strange guy appeared out of nowhere. Zeno's always perfect reflexes failed him this time, so he didn't even notice his appearance. Shihan literally ignored the presence of Zeno and the other knights and walked towards Alita, who was sitting on the ground and catching her breath. The girl was also shocked. Zenon shouted sternly at Shihan's back, demanding an explanation of who he was. Shihan didn't even turn around, and only asked Zeno for forgiveness in advance and admitted that he was not doing this out of personal hostility. And then, in an unexpectedly cold tone, he remarked that he was forced to take action. Zenon looked at Shihan, not imagining how he could bluff like that. And if it wasn't a bluff, then how could this unarmed guy pose a threat? At this moment, Shihan finally turned around and punched Zenon from below upwards, sending him flying above the trees. The knight fell from a height, and his armor thundered from the impact with the ground, and a column of dust rose into the air for the umpteenth time that day. When it cleared slightly, the soldiers saw that their commander had been thrown into the ground by the blow and was lying motionless. A chill ran down the soldiers' spines, because if the girl could cause them serious damage, then what could this unknown hero do? At this time, Alita blinked in surprise because she was sure that Shihan must be in league with the soldiers of the Emperor, with whom they were allies. After the loss of the commander, the sorcerer took control of the detachment and demanded that the soldiers neutralize Shihan. The knights rushed towards Shihan, causing him to be surprised and respected at the same time, as they should have known that this attack was pointless. Shihan, reluctantly and even showing off a little, noted that he didn't want to do this, but he had to, and raised his fist. After this, he sent the knights flying after their commander, repeating his request that they not be offended by him. He playfully trampled some of them into the ground, taking advantage of the fact that their armor was quite strong. The soldiers began to beg for mercy. They were overcome with trepidation before such a powerful fighter, but it was already difficult to stop him. Zeno meanwhile came to his senses and slowly crawled out of the ground. He was irritated and was burning with the desire to ask for an answer for his humiliation. But then Zeno raised his eyes and the desire for revenge began to fade from what he saw. His soldiers were piled haphazardly in the garden. Some stuck into the soil like saplings. Zeno couldn't believe his eyes. This simply couldn't be happening. They were faced with something abnormal that they weren't prepared for. The commander looked at the fallen soldiers and thought that he was lucky, because it looked like the enemy could have done him much more harm. Then it began to dawn on him. Somewhere at the bottom of his memory, long untouched memories stirred, Zenon recognized the guy's movements. Another guy appeared before his eyes, only 10 years younger, in armor, but also throwing away the Imperial Guard, Song Shihan. The boy smiled at him in the same way that Shihan had smiled before, delivering a blow to his opponent that could not be parried. Shihan turned to Zeno and noticed that he had woken up. The boy remarked that if that was the case, the knight was a tough nut to crack. The guy began to approach, honestly warning that Zeno would have to remain unconscious for some time. The knight tried to stop him, he shouted, but Shihan's raised fist had already started moving. Zeno didn't have time to say anything. The blow only knocked the air out of his lungs. Shihan's hook knocked him back into the hole he had created when he fell from a height. Shihan surveyed the carnage he had caused and once again asked everyone not to be offended by him, and the remaining conscious knights asked for peace. The guy good-naturedly agreed, threatening that if anyone else tried to attack him, he would have only himself to blame. The sorcerer tried to take advantage of this opportunity and began to organize a retreat. He wondered where a swordsman of such monstrous strength could come from, and what other surprises could be expected from him. Shihan returned to Alita, and with joy in his voice assured her that there was nothing to be afraid of anymore, and that she could stop sitting on the ground. Alita came out of her stupor, still not fully believing what was happening, and agreed that this was a good idea. He and Shihan walked away, and the knights looked back at them in fear, collecting their fallen comrades. The sorcerer cursed in annoyance. as he knew that they had failed completely and there was nothing they could do about it. However, he ordered the knights to collect all the bodies of the slain in order to prepare them for the return journey. The sergeant of the knights responded to the sorcerer's order with confusion and replied that there was no need for that. He reported that there were no casualties in the battle. An examination showed that the unknown fighter was so skilled that he managed to neutralize everyone without killing or injuring. The sorcerer thought he couldn't be surprised anymore, but the sergeant's report made him wonder again what had happened here that evening. This silent question hung in the evening grove, where the breeze quietly rustled the leaves and the cicadas, not noticing anything, continued to chirp. The night was falling, but the full moon was shining in the sky, so the grove was not completely dark. Alita wandered through the trees holding her broken arm, and Shihan walked behind her. He tried to encourage her, saying that they would not be caught. He thought to himself that he really didn't want them to be followed, since he didn't want to advertise his appearance. Despite his bravado, he felt that the move had not been free, and he was not in the same shape he had been in before returning to his world. His thoughts were interrupted by Alita's moan. She was in pain, and despite all her efforts not to show it, the sound involuntarily escaped from her throat. Shihan asked her how she was, and if she really had a fracture. Alita confirmed in a choked whisper that it was. She added that things could have been much worse, hinting at how Shihan stood up for her. Alita was shaking and her whole appearance was painful, but it seemed like Shihan didn't get the hint, so he found it strange that Alita was trying so hard to pretend that everything was fine. Before she could come to her senses, he had made a splint for her arm and seemed to have used some kind of healing magical techniques. The pain in his arm subsided. Alita showered him with gratitude, so Shihan became embarrassed and, scratching his head, replied that it was a trifle. Alita smiled widely again and concluded that she needed to go her own way to escape from her pursuers. Shihan was dumbfounded by this sudden turn of events. It was illogical that a girl who was in danger was going to break up with the one who protected her. He quickly asked where she was going looking like that and what she was thinking. Alita only promised to be as careful as possible in response, so that he wouldn't have to worry about her. Shihan countered that being careful wasn't enough and that he could help her along the way, especially since he was responsible for what happened. The girl was embarrassed and silent, and it was clear that she had not expected such an attitude, but Shihan could not guess what she was thinking. Then Alita looked at the sky, thought for a bit. The guy decided to give her time to make a decision. Finally, the girl smiled and replied that she agreed to accept the help of the powerful gentleman. Shihan was uncomfortable with such formal address, so he asked to be addressed simply by his first name. He asked the girl about her future plans, in order to understand what awaited them next when the chase for her began. Alita said that the easiest way would be to get to the village of Gorin, but that was no longer safe, since someone would be sent there first to intercept. Therefore, the better option was the longer route over the mountain, which would take them to the trading city of Kagon. And agreeing, they began their journey. The bright sun illuminated the library in the palace of Lilstein. The emperor, like a magician, surrounded himself with books, since knowledge was the basis of his power. Lilstein was currently leafing through one of the books. Standing on the second floor, while the report about yesterday's operation was supposed to be delivered to him, the messenger's voice tore him from his tracks, and Lilstein turned to face the man hurrying toward him. The messenger approached and bowed politely. He said that news had finally arrived from the detachment of knights sent yesterday to Mount Defilon. Lilstein slammed the book shut. This information was interesting to him, and he waited impatiently. But the messenger's confused look made him realize that things had not gone according to plan, and he demanded to be told immediately what had happened. The library was filled with volumes. There were common publications, reference books, treatises, but there were also rarities, the names of which were known only to a few. But behind the library's facade, there was another side to Lilstein's power, with dark galleries leading down from the hall into the dungeons that concealed his secrets. Lilstein walked up the spiral staircase into one of them, the sound of his footsteps muffled in this place where the air seemed dead. Lilstein approached the door with a magic seal and cast a spell. Red flashes ran along the grooves of the door like blood through vessels. The door, as if coming to life, swung open, letting its master inside. Lilstein continued on his way. In the dungeons there was a laboratory. There were flasks and instruments piled up. Books were collected in the cabinets, hidden from prying eyes, and in the center stood a column filled with something that looked like blood. Lilstein for now. He moved on to where a weak voice called his name. He approached the bars behind which the prisoner languished. The man, chained, said in a weak voice that he hated Lilstein. He smirked sarcastically at the fact that the emperor still considered himself a hero after what he had done. A magic circle glowed under the prisoner's feet. Lilstein only sneered that the prisoner had somehow grown thin over the last half-month. And as if spitting, he said that he was a degenerate like everyone else in the Lusklin family. The magician entered the cell and asked the prisoner if he knew what it meant that the magic circle had recently changed color. The man did not answer, and Lilstein answered himself, explaining that this meant the magical transformation was complete. The prisoner ignored this, and, with the last of his strength, shouted furiously that Lilstein's subjects deserved pity because of such a ruler. Lilstein smiled coldly and said that he was sorry too, but for someone else. The one who loses his heart, he finished. And the prisoner pressed himself against the wall in horror, a sticky horror filling his insides. The prisoner's eyes opened wide. He looked into the face of death, and this death was completely indifferent to him, considered him just an instrument. Lilstein plunged his hand straight into the man's chest. Blood spurted in all directions, covering the walls of the cell, the floor, the bars. The prisoner trembled. A wheezing sound came from his throat, and after a couple of seconds he fell silent, while Lilstein methodically finished what he had started. In his palm, just like 10 years ago, a fire burned, devouring the flesh of a recently living man. But Lilstein already saw that there was no result. The man whose heart he burned was too distant a relative of the king, and the strength was not enough. Lilstein sighed, becoming convinced that he needed someone who was very close in origin to Luslanad. He remembered again what the messenger had told him today, about a party being sent after a man who might be the one Lilstein was looking for. The frightened messenger reported the failure, that the detachment had been defeated by one unknown fighter. Only his appearance was known. Dark eyes, black hair. Perhaps he was of the Gallon race. Lilstein's mind, Shihan fit that description, but it was impossible. The magician drove away the obsession because portals do not open on their own. This skill is now unavailable even to him, Lilstein told himself. And the image of the old acquaintance he now feared so much stood before his eyes. A crowded city with tall buildings, wide streets, and bright flags greeted the two travelers with its hectic life and lively street trading. Shihan told Alita that this city was previously called South Clanium, but the city had changed so much that the guy didn't recognize it, even though he had lived here in the past. Alita was surprised and asked how this happened, to which Shihan explained that in the big city it was easy for him to hide when he needed to hide. Shihan said that there was a race called Gallon, which looked like the people of Northern Asia, and then his face changed as if he was a completely different person. Alita looked at Shihan, who was now unrecognizable in fascination, although she knew it was him because he still spoke with his own voice. She asked if the rumors about magical impersonators were true, and he asked if she meant the Empress's powers of 1,000 forms. Shihan revealed that the ability allows one to use combat power to disguise oneself, redirecting it to become like another person. He also added that this skill belongs to Lavina along with the stealth skill, but it was Shihan who invented it and taught it to Lavina. The boy offered to teach Alita too, but she refused, and Shihan still couldn't understand why she was rejecting his offers of help. Embarrassed by this refusal, he said that they at least needed to find somewhere to spend the night, and Alita felt a sense of regret that she couldn't agree. They walked a few blocks, and Shihan asked Alita how she felt about staying at this inn. In front of him stood a tall 3-story house that looked very presentable. Alita was surprised that Shihan knew this hotel too, and he stood there looking lost in memories. The guy replied that he had never been to this hotel before because there used to be a gallows instead, and something inside Alita sank. She handsaw as if now, how in front of him there was a scaffold with a crossbar and a rough rope that had ruined many lives. However, he smiled and said that this place had already changed completely. And with these words, he invited Alita to come in. But she no longer found the idea so attractive. She asked if they would meet ghosts at this inn in that case. But Shihan, either jokingly or seriously, replied that if there was, it meant that he would be able to see his old comrades. The inside of the inn was cozy. On the ground floor, there were many kegs of beer or wine. There were dining tables and a staircase leading up to the bedrooms. After a short conversation, the disgruntled innkeeper gave Shihan the key to the room. As he walked away from the counter, the guy continued to see the owner of the yard getting angry and looking unkindly after him. Shihan asked Alita if she knew why the innkeeper was angry, and she tried to explain in a gentler way. The thing was that Shihan poked everyone in the face instead of addressing them with respect, which made his manner of speaking seem rude. They came into the room, and the guy kept lamenting that he had completely forgotten all propriety. Alita said that it didn't bother her, but the innkeeper was much older. It dawned on Shihan that he had also been treating Alita in a familiar manner, and she could sense his arrogance. Alita told him that she was used to it, and there was no point in changing anything. Shihan sat dejectedly on one of the beds and tried to tame the feeling of shame. The girl pulled him away from his worries, reminding him that he should be concerned with more practical issues, namely, what his plans were, since they were already in Kagon. Shihan simply replied that he was going to stay with Alita to look around and get his bearings after arriving. Alita immediately blurted out in fear that she was against such a decision, mentally reproaching herself for her harshness. She immediately began to explain that because she was being stalked, he would be under constant threat, and she would blame herself for everything that happened. Shihan didn't expect such an answer. To Alita's phrase that she had no reason to take him with her on the run, he hesitated, about to say something. Shihan said that he had to confess, although it was not easy. Alita listened to him attentively, expecting another surprise. The guy said that as soon as he left her, she would be immediately seized. The girl was scared, wanting to know why he was sure of this. Shihan explained that they were found because the summoning was felt by other mages as a surge, and since no one knew about it, they believed that she was the source. Shihan still evokes vibrations of magic, so while they were together, he unwittingly left traces that would make it easy to find her. Alita realized that her attempt to hide in another city was completely crossed out by this new knowledge. She was in the palm of the knight's hand. Shihan said that he had already made sure that the vibrations would stop being caused, but he had not been able to do so yesterday. The guy said that in order to avoid being found, the technique that hides their presence must be used again every couple of days. Alita reluctantly agreed that she needed Shihan's presence, but something else was bothering her. He sat in front of her, ready to hear what she had to say, and Alita asked why he needed her. The Imperial Palace in the capital city of Delstre had a strict architecture, as if it obeyed the regulations, as did the military command that sat inside. Knight Zeno fervently begged his commander, the most serene Endarvin, allow him to send out to search for the fugitives and clear his tarnished honor. Endarvin looked at him skeptically and only sighed meaningfully. Zeno was not the first knight who had confused military plans with personal motives. The officer tried to dissuade the knight, pointing out that the emperor apparently knew about the strength of the fugitives, since the failure of the mission was not followed by punishment. However, Zeno reminded that according to the code, a knight is obliged to do everything to restore his good name if he has not carried out an order. And Darvin perked up. The knightly code had not been mentioned in his presence for a long time, and he realized that before him stood a fanatical knight, of which there had been many before. The officer was moved by the fervor of Zeno's speeches, so he decided that if that was the case, he should really go and fulfill his duty of honor. Zeno thanked Endarvin and left the office, but in fact, as soon as his hand touched the door handle, his thoughts were already far from the debt of honor. The knight was thinking about where the fugitives could be found. Most likely, as swordsmen, they would try their hand at mercenary work. Since they were not found in the village, it seems they went to Kagon, and Zeno could pretend to be the customer in order to lure them out. Zeno was not concerned about the girl the emperor had sent for. No, his mind was occupied by the unexpectedly strong fighter who was with her at the time. Zeno's inner vision again flashed before him, the figure of himself flexing his fists, a figure that was all too familiar. The fighter was a copy of the savior from another world, Song Shihan, but he left their world 10 years ago, and there was no one else who could summon him here. Zeno was eager to know what this mysterious stranger was. It was more important than any unfulfilled orders. Yesterday in Kagon, in the stone house of the Knight Barcelian, which resembled a small fortress, a meeting was held. Letward appeared in the hall and greeted the owner of the house, reporting that guests had arrived. Barcelian asked if these were the visitors he was expecting, as the knight looked more like an aristocrat than a real fighter. The butler confirmed that the visitors were a pair of swordsmen recommended by Kagon, and when they entered, the butler introduced Lita, Relkin, and Sean Stein. Alita whispered to Shihan why he had settled on Sean, to which he replied that it would go unnoticed if she accidentally called him by his real name. The couple stood modestly in the center of the room as they were introduced, the butler reporting that they were both swordsmen of rank. In the world of Terranor, depending on the level of development of magical abilities, hand-to-hand warriors were divided into 6 ranks. The first rank, Grain, only gave the ability to increase one's physical strength through magic. The warrior rank meant that its bearer was able to infuse magic into weapons made of iron, so most swordsmen had this rank. Fighters received the rank of knight if they were able to make their armor magical, and the rank of master meant that its bearer could make any weapon magical. Finally, mighty warriors who could create a blade by infusing the air itself with magic were considered deities. In the history of Terranor, there were only a few people of this rank, and before returning home, Shihan was one of them. As he was being introduced, Shihan thought with displeasure at how low his rank had fallen due to his movements between worlds. But Barcelian, on the contrary, believed that the warrior rank was a sign of great talent for a young guy like Shihan, so he was glad to see them. He briefed the mercenaries on the details of tomorrow's sortie and advised them to get a good rest, as they would definitely need their strength. Alita and Shihan came to his room. The guy fell on the bed and began to grumble regretfully that he was bored doing someone's errands. Then he added that in the old days he would have simply robbed any aristocratic estate that came his way instead. Alita stopped examining her sore arm and looked at Shihan in surprise, saying that this didn't fit with the image of the savior. Shihan replied that his former lover Lavina was a thief, and they saw nothing wrong with that, since the nobility under Lustlanad were scoundrels. But now everything had changed, and Shihan regretfully admitted that their only path was to earn an honest living as heroes by cutting enemies to pieces. Alita thought that this didn't sound very heroic from the outside, and as if guessing, Shihan suggested that they would have to slay some kind of monster. The girl replied that Barcelian seemed to have mentioned a pack of igneous wolves. This is not the first attempt to get rid of them, but the previous detachment was small in number, and now they decided to strengthen their ranks with mercenaries. Shihan smiled and said that the igneous wolves were the first monsters he had ever encountered, and his friends helped him defeat them. A dark image from 10 years ago appeared in his mind, figures seemingly painted black, looking indifferently at his fall into the portal. The smile disappeared and Shihan's gaze became hard, and he suddenly fell silent. But after a little while, he regained his good-natured expression and encouraged Alita that these monsters would be just right for their first joint mission. Alita asked hesitantly why Shihan thought he had lost all his strength when he had defeated her with just a wooden spoon. But the guy raised his finger admonishingly and told her to look at it from the other side, and he had to use a spoon to deal with it. Shihan explained that he was like an international champion who, even without equipment, could win against a fully equipped beginner with his experience. Alita repeated the unfamiliar words of international champion, but Shihan was too lazy to explain, so he simply suggested that she go to bed. The morning was just as clear, summer in Terranor pleased with its beautiful weather. Barcelian inspired his soldiers before the sortie. He was dressed in plate armor and gave a pompous speech. In front of the soldiers, raising his sword up, the knight promised to destroy all the offspring that had settled on his land without an invitation. The soldiers let out an excited cry, while Shihan looked at the scene with skepticism, assessing the nobleman's equipment. Plate armor was good for fighting other knights, but when fighting monsters, it only hindered movement with its weight. He and Alita were still wearing light armor that allowed for maximum maneuverability, and Shihan noted that the knights had not changed at all. The squad had been walking for a long time when the guy asked Alita, who was walking next to him, how her hand was feeling, and she replied that the wound was getting better. Shihan said that it was good because it was time for her to prepare for battle. But Alita did not immediately understand what he was talking about. The guy hinted that there was a sulfurous smell in the air, and it seemed that the other members of the squad also smelled it and began to look around. Suddenly, a large carcass jumped out of the bushes at the people, but due to the speed, no one understood what was happening. Barcelian shouted the order to take up a perimeter defense, but his voice sounded too frightened for a commander. A whole pack of huge red wolves appeared from the thicket, smoke billowing from their mouths and tongues of flame jumping from their eyes. The knight shouted triumphantly at the wolves to attack, holding his sword out in front of him and looking forward to dealing with them. However, the closest wolf lunged at him so sharply that he knocked him down and knocked the sword out of his hand. Shihan looked at this, feeling ashamed for Barcelian, realizing that he was a lousy warrior for an aristocrat. Other wolves began to push back the soldiers, and they, frightened by the fall of their commander, began to sort things out, and Barcelian shouted at them, trying to maintain formation. Shihan decided it was time to save the situation and dealt a powerful blow to the wolf nearby. The monster fell to the ground, its hot blood spurting out. The boy assessed and realized that he had enough skill to kill the pack alone, but he decided to be careful not to stand out too much. While Shihan was looking for a new target, the soldiers were still panicking, thinking that they were doomed. Although they might not have been so wrong, Shihan felt heavy footsteps echoing on the ground. Something large was approaching from the forest. A giant wolf, 3 meters tall, appeared in the clearing, with blue electric discharges dancing at the ends of its fur. Shihan, who had already decided that the fight would be boring, smiled contentedly. The leader of the pack became his main target. He stood at attention, holding his sword out in front of him and watching carefully what the giant creature would do. Those soldiers who still retained some composure threw down their weapons in panic and rushed into the forest in all directions. But Shihan did not need them. Barcelion tried to stop his subordinates. He also understood that the death of the main wolf was a chance to disperse the entire pack. But seeing that the soldiers had already disappeared behind the trees, Barcelion also lost his presence of mind and shouted that Shihan and Alita should deal with the wolf. Alita walked up to her partner, looking at him with a question about what they should do now. And Shihan joked that there were often difficulties in the work of a mercenary. Therefore, the guy instructed Alita to deal with the leader, and he himself planned to neutralize the rest of the pack. The girl clearly did not expect such a turn of events. After throwing away the wolf that had jumped on him, Shihan said that it was just a bunch of wolves and they should be able to handle it. Striking the next beast with his sword, he shouted at the dumbfounded Alita to attack. The girl decided to trust Shihan's tactics and obediently rushed at the leader of the pack, gaining momentum for a powerful blow. She leapt to strike from above, where gravity would give the blow extra energy. The wolf raised its head to meet her, its mouth open. A stream of blue flame, with electrical discharges swarming around it, flew out of this mouth towards Alita, and she was unable to dodge it in a jump. Feeling the heat and pricks of thousands of electric needles on her entire skin, she swung her sword, aiming for the wolf's vulnerable spots on the muzzle. The wolf ducked, and the blow landed on his side, and although blood gushed from the wound, the blow was tangential and only enraged the beast. The wolf bared fangs as long as a human forearm and roared so loudly that the crowns of the nearby trees began to sway. Alita regrouped, and while the wolf was roaring, she was already rushing into a new attack, trying to come up with something more effective than the previous attack. Here the wolf himself gave her the opportunity, bending his muzzle towards her, and the swordswoman, she thrust the sword at full speed near the wolf's eye, putting all her speed into the blow. Shihan, who had scattered the wolves, took a moment to look back and felt respect for his partner. But he saw how everything changed in a split second, and for the first time since his arrival, he felt afraid. The sword was sticking out of the wolf's forehead, but he didn't think of falling. By some terrible chance, the blade thrust into the brain didn't lead to death or loss of consciousness. Alita was also seriously scared because she was sure that she had done it, and now her sword was sticking out of the wolf's face high above the ground. The wolf released a burst of electricity, and a powerful electric arc passed through the girl. She was thrown to the side and fell to the ground unconscious, surrounded by lightning running across the ground. The wolf jumped up to her and grabbed her in his mouth. It was unclear whether he was going to bite her in half and throw her with all his might. Shihan let out a menacing cry, shouting Alita's name. She, of course, did not hear. But this cry gave him strength. Earlier, when they were discussing their future plans at the hotel, Alita asked Shihan what his interest in her was, why he needed her. Shihan had to make another confession at that moment, but he tried to be honest with the girl in everything. He told her about how summoning from another world worked, and then that for his first summoning, the Emperor used other people's hearts. Therefore, the Emperor could no longer simply send him back to Earth even if he wanted to. This time, Shihan has made Alita his summoner, and therefore he needs her in order to stay in Terranor. Shihan rushed towards the wolf, realizing that it was just a stroke of bad luck that could send him back to Earth so soon. After all, if Alita dies, the ritual that summoned him to this world will cease to work. The girl was unconscious and the wolf was carrying her away in its mouth. Shihan couldn't catch up with the giant by simply running. He realized that he was wasting energy on running, and the chance to speed up was moving away from him with every second. He needed to come up with something, urgently. Shihan regretted 10 times that he had given his partner such a risky assignment when he should have been protecting her. The naked walk around the square was already looming before his eyes. He stopped, drew his sword, and began the ritual of using a powerful technique. He had to take a risk, putting everything on the line. Shihan pointed his sword towards the wolf. A fiercely lashing blue stream burst from the blade and flew towards the wolf. This was the energy of the dragon sword. The wolf sensed a threat approaching from behind and turned to face the inexorably rushing wave. A flash of interacting magic flashed, the energy of the dragon sword piercing the wolf's electrical defense. Shihan angrily swung his sword, cutting off the attack, and the blue stream lashing out in different directions died out. He sheathed his sword. The surrounding area was stained with wolf blood. The guy pulled the unconscious Alita out of the predator's mouth and collapsed on the grass next to her, wondering what the desire not to give oneself away leads to. The girl did not come to her senses for a long time, and dusk began to thicken over the forest. Shihan made a fire and helped Alita, who had come to her senses, Sit down next to him and warm up. The girl felt fine, and it seemed the wolf hadn't tried to kill her. She assumed it had something to do with the customs of wolves who had some intelligence, and perhaps they were going to eat her ritually. Alita was also surprised by the existence of a fire wolf that could use electric magic, but Shihan replied that, no matter what, the wolf was dead. Alita had an unspoken question on her lips and looked closely into Shihan's eyes. Finally, she began to speak, and Shihan thought that she might now reproach him for literally putting her on the brink of death. Instead, she asked what she hadn't dared to ask for a long time, namely, why Shihan hid his identity from others when he was a legendary hero. The current emperors must be his friends, so he could return triumphantly and everyone in Terranor would be glad to see him. In response, Shihan said that it would indeed be a great fortune to remain alive if news of his return reached the capital palaces. He confessed that his friends had betrayed him by forcibly sending him back to Earth, and that scene had been before his eyes for 10 years now. Shihan said he still couldn't understand how they could turn against him after everything they had been through together. The fact that none of them had any doubts meant that they had all created and kept this plan a secret for a long time. The boy and the girl fell silent. He didn't want to talk anymore. She was digesting what she had heard, so the silence was filled with the crunch of the fire. Shihan thought that the girl might be scared, because she was forced to be next to him, who turned out to be an enemy of the people in all 6 kingdoms. But Alita only punched her palm, expressing that everything fell into place. She only blurted out that this meant that Shihan had returned for revenge. The guy asked if she fully understood what he meant, and the girl answered affirmatively, asking what was bothering him. Shihan could not bear it any longer and exclaimed that he was, in fact, a man who was threatened by the power of all 6 kingdoms, and she didn't even bat an eyelid. Alita only calmly replied that she had already been an outlaw for these 10 years, so his appearance did not change anything for her. Shihan praised this approach to life, to which Alita smiled and said that her father also praised her for her optimism. The guy asked with disbelief whether she was talking about the Emperor, but the girl immediately shook her head and explained that she was talking about Kirin. Shihan realized how much the dead bodyguard meant to his partner, and how far the heiress of Luslanad was from her cruel ancestor. Their conversation was interrupted by a vague rustling sound. Alita did not pay attention to it, but Shihan became wary and began to peer into the thick of the forest. He said that something was definitely moving towards them and prepared for a possible attack. The boy and girl stood up. Alita was still unsteady on her feet, and Shihan was ready to use all his strength without delay. The sounds were getting closer. Alita asked if it could be an enemy, to which Shihan said that it was more likely someone missing from Barcelian's squad. The guy told his partner to get ready because the crunching of branches and rustling were already heard very close. A man wearing a cuirass over a regular shirt appeared from behind the bushes. It was a man, but it was still difficult to recognize him in the dark. The man spoke up, asking for forgiveness for disturbing him and asking for directions, but as he came closer, he stopped short. Shihan and Alita were also in shock. The one in front was someone they didn't expect to see here. Knight Zeno came out to the fire, although no longer in full armor, with a sword on his back, although his appearance did not show hostility. Zeno was also perplexed. This meeting was unexpected for all of them. Alita, despite her condition, pulled out her sword and was ready to hit Zeno with all her might in revenge for her injured arm. The tip of the sword whistled a centimeter from Zeno's face, but he stepped back without attacking. He waved his unarmed hands and asked them to stop, claiming he did not want to get into a fight. By this time, Shihan was already breathing down the knight's neck, which brought back fresh, unpleasant memories for the knight. Shihan said that no matter what, Zeno would have to sleep again, and gathered his magical energy into his fist. And with a practiced movement, he once again sent the knight flying so that his armor only clanked. But Zeno, in the air, was completely convinced of his assumption and also concentrated his magic. This allowed him not to fall down powerlessly, but to perform a smooth turn and land on his feet, maintaining stability. This was a major surprise to Shihan. It wasn't that the knight had become more dangerous, but it was a mystery how he had managed to do so. The knight landed a dozen steps away from where he had been standing, and Shihan walked towards him to find out what was going on. He directly asked the knight how he was able to cancel the magic attack, since it was the use of a rare personal skill that few people knew about. Now Shihan wanted to find out who Zeno was and what he knew. Zeno only replied that he knew nothing, but he had guesses, and these guesses were fully confirmed by today's meeting. The knight reached into his bag and Shihan, thinking that there might be a weapon there, prepared to parry the blow. He shouted at the knight asking what he was trying to get, making it clear that the response would be immediate. However, when he saw what Zenon was pulling out from the bag compartment, Shihan was stunned and speechless. With a stony expression, Zenon picked up the item he had retrieved and held it out to Shihan. They were panties, blue-striped, cleanly washed and neatly folded. Zeno asked if they belonged to Shihan. Shihan and Alita froze at the absurdity of what was happening. If this was the Emperor's plan to capture them, then he had no shortage of imagination. But Zeno continued to hold his underpants in his hands in front of him, and a satisfied smile spread across his face as if he had achieved a long-desired goal. Forgetting his promise to protect Alita, Shihan asked the girl to kill this pervert, to which Zenon again asked for her word. He apologized and said that he had been misunderstood, but Shihan was so discouraged that he didn't really want to listen. Zeno waved his underwear, shouting that he surrendered, and the couple thought he was using the rag as a white flag. But then Shihan's eyes caught a tag that was not usually found on panties made in Terranor. It was a tag with his name on it. The guy recognized his handwriting on the tag. He realized that this was indeed a thing that belonged to him and which he did not expect to see. Zeno triumphantly confirmed that there was no mistake here. All that was left was for Shihan to admit that he really was the savior from another world. Shihan realized that this man recognized him despite the strength he had lost due to the move, and now Zenon asked if Shihan remembered him. It turned out that Shihan had saved Zenon as a child 12 years ago in the village of Biren, and the knight spoke of it with genuine warmth. Shihan tried to remember what happened there in those ancient times and what kind of village Biren it was, because there were more than one similar story. Zenon said that back then, Shihan also defeated the Imperial soldiers with his skill of throwing from a height to the ground. Shihan had a flash of memory of a village, knights stuck haphazardly into the ground, and a grimy boy sitting on the ruins. Shihan himself was still young and just coming into his own, but in the eyes of this boy, he was already the greatest hero. Zeno then decided to become a swordsman himself and studied the techniques that the savior possessed, in particular his technique that allowed him to cancel the skill of striking the ground. When Zenon said that a skill that didn't cripple the opponent spoke of Shihan's humanism, he remembered that he was just experimenting, but tactfully kept silent. It then dawned on Shihan that if this knight was a child 12 years ago, then he was very young. Zenon confirmed that he was only 22, despite the fact that he was already a squad leader and looked like a respectable man. In response, the knight replied that appearance is secondary to the inner convictions that determine a person's value. But when asked what this phrase was, Zeno replied that it was a quote from the savior, and Shihan felt like a star because he was being quoted. However, even after all the explanations, he still didn't understand what the underwear had to do with it. But the knight said that it wasn't just underwear. He admitted that it was part of a collection of things related to the savior from another world. And there were several books in this collection, and also sketches with images of the savior, which were drawn during the time when Shihan was still traveling around Terranor. Zeno simply and openly admitted that from that moment in childhood he worshipped him, the legendary hero. Shihan himself didn't know what to think in such a situation. He had never heard such confessions before, but 10 years of absence had prepared special surprises for him. Zeno said that these were the underpants that the savior had worn during the battle with Luslanad, and they had cost him an astronomical amount. Shihan wanted to stop these revelations, so he simply asked Zeno to hide the ill-fated panties away because the matter was settled. Zeno knelt down and presented the sword to Shihan, the knight saying that he had served Lilstein as an ally of the savior, but now wished to serve him himself. Shihan asked what he would do if Lilstein suddenly turned out to be an enemy of the savior. Zeno answered without hesitation that Shihan's enemies would become his enemies because he believed in his idol and his fight against evil. The knight humbly awaited the answer. He put his whole fate on the line at that moment, admitting his readiness to renounce the emperor. Shihan was silent and pondered the situation. Weighing the pros and cons, this man was contradictory. In the end, he agreed. Since Zenon knew who Shihan was, he needed to be kept close, so all he could do was trust him. Shihan took Zeno's sword and tested its weight, assessing what kind of warrior was capable of handling it. Since he had become an idol, he took advantage of the right to accept a knight into his service and solemnly listened to his oath. Zenon's stride looked happy. It seemed like something he couldn't even dream of had come true. The knight fervently promised not to let him down and to justify his trust, and then volunteered to exterminate the remaining wolves. Shihan replied that there was no need for that, since the leader had already been defeated and was lying a couple dozen meters from the clearing. Zeno was surprised and added that he might not have understood the entire plan of his newly minted commander. He said that fire wolves always live in pairs and suggested that the giant wolf's corpse was bait to kill its female. Shihan realized that the bravado of experience sometimes misfires, and that he had completely forgotten such trifles as the family structure of some monsters. As he once again fought off a wave of shame, Alita felt a chill inside because they had been sitting here carefree all this time. All three approached the carcass of the dead wolf, and a she-wolf, even more massive and terrifying, rose to her paws from the shadows. Tongues of magical flame danced an intricate dance around the she-wolf, and she slowly began to approach the group of heroes, surprisingly silently. Shihan cursed himself for such a shameful oversight. It was obvious that the huge leader could not be a loner, otherwise his life would not be easy. Alita asked what about the vaunted experience, to which Shihan replied with a hurt expression that a person who had long since graduated from school would also not be able to solve the equation. The girl asked what an equation was, and Shihan scratched his head, realizing that he needed to choose better examples when explaining. Zeno, however, took the she-wolf as a chance to show himself and earnestly asked Shihan to give him the opportunity to deal with the monster. Shihan agreed, deciding to satisfy the knight's request and get rid of the troublesome work at the same time. Zeno stood in front of the she-wolf and pulled out his huge sword. It seemed the monster did not understand what a serious opponent it would have to deal with. Zeno wanted to demonstrate his highest level of skill in order to impress his idol and earn respect. After all, the last time in the fight he only hit the ground twice, and it couldn't be called a decent fight. The knight began the ritual, and yellow flashes began to surround him where the tip of the sword cut through the air. The weapon was imbued with magic. Alita was amazed by this skill, and Shihan condescendingly noted that Zenon was overdoing it and could have been defeated in a simpler way. The she-wolf rushed towards Zeno, simultaneously opening her mouth and striking from the side with her huge, flaming claws. Shihan retaliated with his sword, releasing a wave of bright yellow light that aimed at the beast's head. The knight let out a battle cry. Now he himself looked like an igneous wolf. His eyes were also burning. Swing followed swing, dealing crushing blows to the she-wolf time after time, although she, too, clearly had no intention of giving up easily. Alita was deeply impressed. Now she understood how strong an opponent she had fought in front of her home. Alita agreed that although she was a skilled warrior, this guy could do something too. Alita indignantly asked what the phrase, "can do something" meant, to which Shihan smiled and replied that geniuses were annoying and that he had high expectations. Then he added that he, of course, was not even a genius, but simply an alien from Earth, and that the genius he knew was precisely Lavina. Alita thought that Shihan was nostalgic for the old days, since he remembered this Lavina so often. Meanwhile, Zeno's fight continued. Flames began to burst from the wolf's mouth to the sides. It seemed that she had accumulated enough fire in herself. A wave of tension shook her body, and a scorching stream rushed forward, burning everything that came in its path. But Zeno was strong enough to block the effects of the fire, breaking the stream with his sword. Alita had done not long before. Alita wanted to warn him not to do that, and Shihan wanted to slap his face, but he also found it funny. The she-wolf struck Zeno with lightning as he fell on her, which he clearly did not expect, so much so that he even dropped his sword. The knight fell to the ground, wisps of smoke rising from him. The magic did not cause him critical damage, but he was temporarily out of the battle. Alita asked if she looked exactly the same from the outside, to which Shihan laughingly replied that he had déjà vu. Zeno shouted an indignant question to his comrades, asking how it was that the fire wolves began to strike with lightning. Alita offered to defeat the wolf, believing that she already knew about the trick and would cope more successfully this time. But Shihan decided to do it himself. He said that his main feature was immunity to magic, and Alita realized that this was due to moving from another world. The power of the creatures that her family was famous for being able to summon was based precisely on the ability to not receive damage from magic. Song Shihan, despite his human nature, was the same kind of being. Now he stood in front of the she-wolf in a relaxed pose. The monster spat fire again, putting all its fury into it. Shihan ignored the fire without even using any techniques. The magical nature of the flames did not allow the flames to interact with him. The guy smiled because before he couldn't afford to turn around because of extra eyes, but now they were alone here. The wolf released lightning bolts, and Shihan unexpectedly received a full charge, causing his teeth to chatter. Zeno was as amazed as his idol, and Alita thought that sometimes Shihan should be more careful with his arrogance. "What about déjà vu?" she shouted at him, to which he irritably demanded that she not imitate him. Shihan jumped to his feet, absorbed in the thought of how it was that the magic worked on him, while the wolf's mouth was already flying towards his head. Hearing the whistle, Shihan suddenly turned around with an expression as if he was about to swat an annoying fly. He swung his sword, releasing a blue arc so bright it seemed white, putting all his anger at the sudden humiliation into it. The she-wolf rolled like a limp rag and flew away several dozen meters. Shihan thought that the magical fire did not harm him, which meant that the electric discharge was somehow different. Zeno ran up to him and asked if Sir Shihan was okay, to which he insistently asked to simply call him by his name from now on. At this point, they all looked around as a strange, ghostly light began to stream from the body of the fallen monster. The carcass began to disintegrate into small, glowing pieces that flew into the sky and dispersed. The whole company looked puzzled at yet another unfamiliar magical effect, adding a new mystery to everything that was happening. Shihan watched carefully, realizing that he had never seen anything like it before. If this was the magic of some magician, then he possessed special magic. The next day, joyful cries were heard in Barcelian's house, and the company of 2 mercenaries was greeted very warmly. The aristocrat was sincerely grateful to the warriors for saving his lands from disaster, shamefully not remembering his escape. For the completed task, Barcelian gave them 2 heavy purses containing 600 silver coins. As Shihan left the estate, he shook his purses with satisfaction and told Alita that this was not a bad profit, although they would need more money. The guy's eyes were already blazing with money fever, and he was thinking out loud about where else he could find difficult tasks. And Alita looked at him skeptically. On the street, they met Zeno, who asked if everything was in order with the payment for the completed task. Then he added that he heard their conversation about money from afar and handed them another purse with 100 gold coins. Shihan and Alita looked at this wealth in disbelief, wondering where Zeno got it from. They pounced on him with questions, and Zeno became sad before answering. The knight admitted that he had sold those very same savior's underpants, and that this was a significant loss to his collection. Shihan already regretted that he decided to find out about the origin of the gold, and Zeno said that he was ready to do anything for the sake of his commander. Alita sarcastically remarked that if Shihan's underwear was so expensive, they could have sold another pair, to which Shihan quickly retorted that those were special. Zeno asked what their future plans would be, given that the money would last for a certain time and they could not engage in mercenary work for now. Shihan replied that he had 3 options, but he had not yet made his final decision, and that there was one place that would not be difficult to conquer. At this time, he was sorting through gold coins and looking with interest at the image on one of them. Shihan said that he would finally see his face again, and Alita and Zenon looked at Shihan questioningly. Who did he mean? Shihan said that he had decided, and that they would have to go north. His face became stern. Their target was the kingdom of Jacksongard, and it was his face, the face of a former ally, and at the same time a traitor that was minted on the coin. Lilstein's laboratory, although no one was visible except the Emperor. The voice of the interlocutor came from a tub filled with water and standing on the table. It was Trandon, one of the powerful sorcerers of Lilstein. The Emperor kindly asked why Trandon wanted to talk to him, since the time for the next report had not yet come. Trandon reported the news that subjects 11 and 12 were no longer leaving problems, as Barcelian himself was able to deal with them. Lilstein chuckled approvingly. The wolves really weren't that strong, and maybe there was just someone who could handle them. But that was not all, Trandon seemed to hesitate to say, and was stalling for time. Finally, he blurted out that the test subject was also lost, causing Lilstein's face to twist into a grimace of rage. Lilstein leaned toward the water, so that Trandon on the other side felt fear, despite the distance that separated them. Lilstein shouted how dare Trandon consider himself the head of the Ivory Tower if he made such a mistake. The 4 magical towers of Terranor, red, white, blue, and black, were made of ivory. The former emperor, being the most powerful magician, collected knowledge and wisdom in these towers. The knowledge was distributed according to complexity and sophistication across the floors, so that new magicians rose higher and higher as they learned. Lilstein was the head of the Red Tower. He had reached the highest level of mastery. The emperor reminded Trander that he was only in charge of the tower because his competitors had been executed, and that his place was on the 8th floor. Lilstein demanded that the subject be dealt with alone as quickly as possible and warned that this was the last chance. Trander felt a drop of sweat trickle down his temple. Lilstein's face disappeared and only water remained in the tub. Trander sighed heavily. He tried to calm his nerves because they would not help him in solving the issue. After all, he could have been ordered to be killed right now, but instead he could still try to save the situation. In the semi-ring of mountains in the north was the capital of the kingdom of Jacksongard, the crowning glory of which was the monumental royal palace. The heels of a man in a white robe clicked loudly along the palace corridor, paved with skillfully decorated tiles, as he walked towards the royal chambers. The man opened the massive door and looked around for the king. Then he called his master. Emperor Jacksonguard responded and asked his squire what was the matter and why he was disturbing him. However, being in a good mood, Jacksonguard invited the squire to drink with him, who came up and saw the emperor surrounded by wine and girls. The squire asked wearily if the emperor was again indulging in amusements, forgetting about everything else. Jacksonguard replied that what was the point of being an emperor if not to enjoy whatever one's heart desired. The squire warned that a life spent in carousing, with pressing issues not being resolved, was dangerous to imperial power. Jacksonguard waved it off, confidently declaring that the people loved him and his power was not in danger. The squire was inwardly indignant that Jacksonguard did not understand that people could be angered by the sight of a ruler who wasted money collected from their taxes. Jacksonguard remarked that he had lowered taxes, to which the squire replied that even so they remained high. Jacksonguard claimed that Luslanad had burned villages and taken people into slavery, but the squire countered that now people were simply punished or drafted into the army. Jacksonguard shook his head and said that he could not be compared to a tyrant and that he deserved a reward for overthrowing Luslanad. The squire was about to say something else, but Jacksonguard's patience was already running out, and his voice sounded like steel. The emperor looked sternly at his subordinate and said with emphasis that he did not understand hints. The squire was frightened and looked down. He realized that he had gone too far in this argument. He bowed, submitting to the will of the ruler, and backing away, headed towards the exit. Already having left the door, the squire covered his face with his hands, his soul raging with resentment and a premonition that nothing good awaited their kingdom. Jacksonguard may have been a mighty fighter in excellent physical condition, inspiring fear just by his appearance, but ruling a country was not his calling. Jacksonguard felt that this conversation had spoiled all his fun. He thought that perhaps it would be worth dismissing the annoying servant. Here another visitor came in to see him. Unlike the squire, he, without hesitation, opened the door and resolutely entered the chambers. The man who entered was full of flattering greetings. He was dressed in a business suit and carried a stack of documents under his arm. Jacksonguard greeted Count Celton with joy, whom he was always glad to see, as he constantly heard compliments from him. Celton apologized for the sudden intervention and said that he was forced to, as matters had arisen that required the emperor's attention. Celton handed the documents to Jacksonguard, and the ruler tried to understand the squiggles, which were always difficult for him. After spending 5 minutes unsuccessfully trying to understand the essence of the papers Celton had brought, he felt irritated. Jacksonguard threw the papers aside and said he was allowing Celton to make his own decisions as he saw fit. Jacksonguard declared that as king he should not be busy with paperwork, but with real royal business, protecting the innocent and the suffering. On the western outskirts of the capital, from where only the tops of the roofs of the royal palace were visible, guests appeared whom Jacksonguard did not expect. In front of Shihan and his companions stood a peeling, dilapidated two-story house. It seemed that this hut had seen several generations of people. Alida looked at the purchase with doubt, but Shihan said that staying at the inn would be too dangerous. Zeno agreed with the commander's argument, but said that he had an objection of a different kind. The knight was inwardly indignant that the savior would live in a wretched house, absolutely unworthy of a hero, and so Zeno was determined to do something. Inside, they were met with cobwebs, dirt, and peeling paint, but Shihan looked pleased and said that everything was better than he expected. Zeno, who was standing behind him, was silent. But this silence was ringing. Shihan understood that he fundamentally disagreed with something. The knight exclaimed that this house would be a cursed place where Shihan couldn't be until Zenon fixed everything. He threw Shihan and Alida out on the street and began to restore the house to the proper order that Zeno envisioned it to be. Inside the house, there were furious rustlings, creaking, and rumblings, and magical flashes were visible through the windows. Shihan and Alida sat in the courtyard, periodically exchanging puzzled glances and exchanging jokes about how these sounds did not sound like cleaning at all. When they went inside in the evening, they couldn't believe their eyes. It seemed as if Zenon had not only cleaned up, but had also managed to do some repairs. Shihan was dismayed by the cleanliness, and Zeno still complained that the house remained squalid and had no furniture. Listening to Zeno's lamentations that he had missed some dirt somewhere, Alida thought that the best way to take Zeno out of the fight was to spit on the floor. Shihan was pleased. He tried to reassure Zeno that it was not bad for a start, and that he had done an excellent job. He already had a premonition of meeting Jacksonguard, who had aged 10 years, but was still the same rude, narcissistic, handsome man. The feeling that the plan was beginning to be implemented filled Shihan with triumph, and he called his comrades to make further preparations. The trio gathered in a large room to discuss their next steps. Zenon began to talk about the 6 kingdoms of Terranor. The states of Lilstein and Anasius were considered rich and more powerful than the others. The kingdoms of Saffron and Fellos were inferior, but still developed quite successfully. But Jacksongard and Teorante were experiencing problems, as their rulers were not very successful in fulfilling their duties. Moreover, the states were in conflict, the last of which occurred recently. It was the Kagon War. The dispute between Lilstein and Anasius arose over claims to the ownership of Kagon, but everything was settled with the intervention of other kingdoms. Jacksongard came up with a formula that would prevent aggression, stating that the others would support the enemy of whoever attacked Kagon. Thanks to this, Kagon was not harmed, and later the disputes over management rights were resolved through diplomatic means. Shihan chuckled in satisfaction, pleased by the news that his former allies were not presenting a united front. He told Zeno that his former friends had clearly lost their common sense, and that greed for power had clouded their vision so much that they had forgotten about friendship. Zeno agreed with Shihan and was indignant at how he could have served for so many years one of these scoundrels who were plotting against the savior. Shihan shook Zeno to distract him from these thoughts and reminded him that the savior was alive, and what's more, he was here. They went out into the courtyard, where Alita was practicing magic in the fresh air, or rather, the skill that Shihan had told her about. Alita was a little upset. She looked tired, and without her leather protection, she looked like a schoolgirl. The girl tried to change her appearance with the help of magic, but she got something ugly, a face that did not hold its shape with rough features. Shihan saw this grimace and couldn't help but laugh. Alita admitted that she wasn't coming out and asked why he was laughing. It seemed like she hadn't looked in the mirror. Shihan repeated his instructions that the energy should wrap around the girl's face with an invisible hand. He said that the skill does not change the face but rather covers it with makeup that changes the appearance, and this thin cover needs to be stabilized. Alita looked at her comrade with a reproachful look, her voice betraying displeasure. She said that he just kept repeating the same thing over and over again. And although he was a master of the skill, explanations were not his outstanding talent. Shihan admitted that he himself did not understand how he did it, so he could only quote Lavina's explanations when she taught others. Alita asked how he mastered the skill, but Shihan replied that he and Zenon unfortunately could not use that method. And the reason for this is that Shihan came from Earth, so everything is different with him than with the inhabitants of Terranor. People in these two worlds, despite their outward indistinguishability, perceive magic differently. Terranor's inhabitants must engage in spiritual practices in order to master their fighting energy, as if they were wandering through a dark warehouse. The Zemlians, including Shihan, see this warehouse so they can simply come up and take what they need, master the technology they want. Thanks to this, it took Shihan only 3 years to achieve the highest possible mastery in combat and magical skills. Alita was angry at such injustice, and Shihan honestly admitted that for this reason he cannot consider himself a genius. Shihan added that Lilstein had researched this, and it turned out that this effect was not limited to Earth, but that the restructuring occurred when passing through a portal. Alita noted with displeasure that it was a shame that some portal passage would grant such an incredible talent. Shihan admitted that he did not claim to be a good teacher, and she would have to try to master the technique on her own. He was about to leave, but Alita called out to him, some idea flashing in her eyes. She asked that if a person from Terranor were sent to another world and then brought back, would he become as strong as Shihan? Shihan realized that he had never thought of such an idea before. This girl definitely had a subtle mind and was more intelligent than him. The guy replied that in theory it could work, but then their conversation was interrupted by the rumble of boulders falling from a height. All three felt a slight vibration coming straight from the ground. They looked at each other, and Zeno suggested that it might be an earthquake. But Shihan said that it wasn't it because he felt a foreign energy and it seemed familiar to him, but that would be incredible. The tremors became stronger, and buildings in the city began to collapse. There were screams from people who did not have time to jump out of their houses and fell under the rubble. Some died, and some screamed to be pulled out. Mixed with all this were other screams, shrill cries of horror that people emitted at the sight of huge predatory creatures as tall as a house. The cat-like muzzles and huge sharp fangs did not promise anything good to an ordinary person who found himself in dangerous proximity to them. The creatures resembled something between a bear and a lion. Their mane was not very pronounced, and their body had a stockier build. Finally, someone yelled that it was the Leokans and called for them to run, but everyone who was nearby was already running away. The young girl stumbled and fell behind the others, and the Leokans were already at her side. A clawed paw with long fingers was about to grab her. The girl tried to crawl, but this certainly would not save her. At that moment, the figure of a swordsman appeared between the beast and the man, and with a sharp blow he knocked away the predator's paw. Shihan casually asked the girl if she was safe and helped her run away from the monsters. Alita and Zeno were nearby with their swords at the ready, all three of them wondering how more than 30 creatures ended up in the thick of the capital. Shihan said that there was definitely a catch to this situation, although it was not yet clear what it was. He said that we would have to sacrifice stealth and fight back against the monsters, otherwise there would be countless victims in the city. Zeno attacked first, stabbing the beasts until blood covered the pavement. Shihan and Alita covered his flanks so that the rest of the Laokans could not encircle them. In the heat of battle, the comrades did not notice how someone approached them from behind. These were people in armor and with weapons, apparently city guards. They demanded that the battle be stopped. Shihan did not understand what was being discussed at first and was glad to have reinforcements that would help stop the monsters. But the knights were in no hurry to rush to help and looked sternly at Shihan and his companions. Then they came and surrounded them, threatening them with their swords. Shihan realized that the guards were not going to fight the monsters. The guard commander accused the trio of disobedience. He said that the Dark Lion Knights were in control of the situation and demanded that they retreat. Alita asked what the hell was going on and demanded that the knights protect the townspeople or at least not interfere. But the knights demanded that they stop resisting and shut their mouths. They declared that they were acting at the will of the king. Zenon asked Shihan what kind of farce was going on here, but he shrugged his shoulders, not knowing the answer himself. Here he felt with his back that a very important moment would soon come. Shihan turned around. His gaze became hard and his whole body tensed. Behind the knights, through the flames of a fire in one of the destroyed houses, the silhouette of a man was already visible. Shihan felt the approach of this person. Magic could not lie. They were well acquainted. Her firm gait kicked up clouds of dust from the road. She was confident and commanding. The figure shouted to the beast that they had dared to attack his people in vain. Through the smoke, a broad male torso, clad in barbarian armor, was visible. Jacksonguard, throwing a huge axe over his shoulder, shouted encouragingly that people should not be afraid of monsters because he had come to protect everyone. The Emperor ordered the knights to cover the people, and he himself militantly threatened the monsters. The knights stood in front of the townspeople, closing their ranks with their shields facing outwards so that nothing from outside could break through. Shihan looked closely at his old acquaintance as he hurried towards the Leokans, trying to notice every detail, every change. Jacksonguard, showing off, shouted to the monsters that his body had managed to lose its shape without fighting, as if the beasts cared. The Emperor gave a war cry that promised death to the Leokans, and with huge axes in each hand, made an attacking leap. Seeing these axes, the people let out a murmur of admiration. Few had seen such a powerful warrior in action. The Leokans took devastating damage, Jacksonguard cutting off pieces of them with a single blow. In battle, he laughed, feeling his complete superiority. The blood that flowed down his armor was like a natural element of clothing for him. Feeling such pressure, the Leokans pressed their ears and whined cowardly, rushing about the street. The monsters tried to run away, but it seemed Jacksonguard was determined not to give them a chance to return. His flight only filled him with contempt for these creatures, and he shouted an insult after them. Then he stamped his mighty foot in a forged boot, as if demanding that the Leokans return to his foot like trained dogs. But this kick was just the beginning of a powerful technique. A circle of light flashed under Jacksonguard. Beams burst out from it, rushing along the ground. Zeno whispered in delight that this was a battle seal that he had only heard about but had never seen before. Alita asked what kind of combat seal it was, and Zenon explained that it was a skill only available to swordsmen with the rank of master. The battle seal was a type of magic seal that used the warrior's fighting energy. Jacksonguard shouted one last threat at the fleeing Leokans and swung his fist. This was the last movement. After that, the giant's hand battle seal released its destructive energy and caught up with the monsters, bringing them death. The people rejoiced at such a spectacular victory, which demonstrated the power of their ruler and his ability to protect them from terrible enemies. Alita looked at this with horror. She had never seen such fighting techniques. Zenon had envy in his eyes. Shihan, as usual, looked with skepticism. At this time, the puzzle in his head was coming together into a single whole, and he felt even greater disgust towards Jacksonguard. Jacksonguard stood triumphantly, waving his arms to the crowd as he stood on the carcass of the fallen Leokan, and only Shihan knew that it was a staged performance. The sudden appearance of monsters in the city, the guards pushing them out of the way of the Emperor, all for the sake of creating an image. But the plan seemed too cunning. Jacksonguard's face was genuinely cheerful. Shihan remembered him as a man with firm ideals who would not fall for treacherous deception. Something didn't add up. It was obvious that this was a setup, but Shihan had doubts about the Emperor's role. If Jacksonguard had planned this whole intrigue, he would hardly have been able to feign ignorance so well. The Emperor basked in the people's love. This was another way for him to amuse his ego while being a ruler. Shihan realized that this idiot actually believed that the monsters had appeared by chance and that he had saved everyone. The naive hero, who thinks that he is in charge of everything in this kingdom, was now smiling and did not know that he had become a puppet of someone from his retinue. Shihan thought that it would be more dignified if he really was one of the organizers of this intrigue. But it seems that simplicity bordering on stupidity played a cruel joke on Jacksonguard. Here Jacksonguard, looking around the jubilant crowd, lingered his gaze on Shihan, who stood, not sharing the general delight. Shihan thought that he was recklessly staring at the Emperor, openly expressing how different he was from everyone else. Jacksonguard felt that the man he met eyes with was not just an ordinary citizen, but he did not recognize his former friend. He thought, trying to fish out of his memory an image that stubbornly refused to surface. Here one of the guards distracted him, offering to return to the palace, since the threat to the city had already passed, and the Emperor absent-mindedly agreed. He decided that if he had not remembered something, it was not a big deal, and to the delighted cries of the crowd, he left, accompanied by knights. Shihan thought with some disappointment that even after 10 years, Jacksonguard was still stupid, but extremely strong and sturdy in body. He decided that they still did not have enough strength for open confrontation, and that it was necessary to prepare carefully. The capital lived its own life day after day they passed, repeating the usual routine to the residents. In 10 days, Alita was able to master the Empress's 1,000 appearance skill and could now change her appearance. Shihan told Zenon about the mountain destruction technique he had created, and Zenon compensated for Shihan's weak teaching skills with diligence. Shihan himself was constantly busy, increasing the amount of combat and magical energy available to him. All this time they were waiting for something that could make it easier for them to defeat Jacksonguard. And then one day this opportunity arose. A large poster was hung in the city square, around which a lot of people gathered. The poster announced a recruitment drive for a squad that was to defeat the pagans who had settled near the city and were sending demons from there. The three heroes were also interested in the poster, but they couldn't get close because of the crowd. Shihan asked what kind of pagans they were, and Zenon tried to read it. Shihan knew that even during the time of the previous emperor, there were groups of fanatics who believed that there was a god Heros living in another world. Zeno said that the old pagans had long been suppressed, but these, as written on the poster, have a new teaching. Shihan snorted dismissively. However, when Zeno said that the new pagans believed in the second coming of the Savior, Shihan suddenly became serious. He immediately became much more curious and asked again, to which Zeno read that the pagans considered Shihan to be the son of Heros, who would punish Terranor. Allegedly, Shihan was supposed to take everyone to the paradise on Earth, but the current evil rulers did not allow this to happen, which is partly true, Zeno added. Shihan thought that all sorts of strange things had happened here since he left, but this expedition might be to their advantage. Jacksonguard, knowing his character, will personally lead this kind of mission to suppress dissidents. And if the trio of heroes also take part in the campaign, getting close to the Emperor will be much easier than trying to get into his palace. On the day the march began, the volunteers gathered in the square, from where they were to set out in an organized manner. A man much smaller than Jacksonguard rode out on horseback in front of the people, introducing himself as Count Celton and saying that he would lead the expedition. Alita asked herself who this man was and why he would be in charge, and Shihan simply leaned over in disappointment and shook his head. His expectations were not met, and Shihan believed that they were embarking on a difficult and long journey that would be of no use. But he regained his spirits with the thought that the expedition might yield some information. But the question of where Jacksonguard was remained open. Shihan did not know what it cost Celton to persuade the Emperor not to take part in the campaign when he was burning with righteous anger, wanting to exterminate the pagans. Celton himself was not thrilled that he was taking part in this, since he was not a fighter, but a palace aristocrat. But the messenger of Emperor Lilstein earnestly asked to hide the truth from Jacksonguard and his knights. Celton was confident that he could pull this off behind his emperor's back, as he had done many times before, taking advantage of his indifference. Lilstein's messenger was Trandon, with whom he had long made profitable deals, directing the policies of Jacksonguard for good reward. Trandon promised reinforcements of 10 ivory tower mages and 5 knights. All that was required of Celton was to recruit a militia. Celton's task was to pacify the pagans with the militia, and the mages and knights would independently carry out their mission under this cover. A large procession led by Celton emerged from the city gates and walked along the road towards the forest. The preacher called out to the crowd gathered in front of a fire built at the entrance to a huge cave. He proclaimed that those who do not believe in the second coming have organized an armed campaign against the true believers, and now this detachment is coming here. The preacher reminded that there is no need to fear death because it is the path to heaven, and godless fools simply do not understand this. He smiled at the crowd, showing his joy, welcoming death as a release and trying to convey this feeling to others. The preacher also reminded that suicide cannot serve as a path to heaven, since it contradicts the teachings of heroes. Instead, we need to help others get to heaven, he concluded, and called for volunteers who were selected for today's ritual. 3 figures came forward, 2 men and 1 still very young girl, their appearance hidden by thick cloaks like all members of the cult. The preacher approached each one and blessed them with the name of heroes, inspiring them to sacrifice. The girl responded to the priest with childish delight. The preacher's name was Lactrin, and she, in a voice full of sincerity, told him that she was not afraid. Lactrin only gave her a silent smile. If it weren't for the setting, it might have seemed like he was literally radiating kindness. Finally, the priest spread his hands and began the ritual, calling upon the dragon sent by heroes to accept the sacrifice. The 3 chosen ones looked into the darkness of the cave, awaiting their fate. One of the men broke out in a cold sweat, and the girl seemed mesmerized. A dragon's head appeared from the cave. It hung at a height of 15 meters and looked over the crowd in front of the entrance. The dragon's head had spikes sticking out, forming a kind of crown behind which a long, stocky neck and a powerful, large torso appeared. The chosen ones were delighted at the sight of the giant, and the rest of the cultists were also in ecstasy. The girl could not stand it and shouted to the dragon a request to accept their devotion as a gift to heroes. The dragon did not keep itself waiting long. Its jaws snapped 3 times. Streams of blood sprayed in different directions, and this was all that remained of the chosen ones. The crowd of cultists cheered, emitting an inarticulate roar of approval. The dragon turned around, showing his thick tail, and disappeared into the cave, and the preacher proclaimed that Heros had blessed his loyal servants for the fight. As the cultists turned and went to prepare for battle, Lactrin exhaled, satisfied that everything was going according to plan. Only the magic potion in his bag was running out too quickly, and he didn't like that. The potion was made from the ashes of the hearts of members of the Laxlin clan, and it was this, in combination with the sacrifices, that gave Laxtrin power over the dragon. However, sooner or later the ashes will run out, and the dragon will no longer be usable. But Lactrin has not yet decided how he will maintain faith in his words. However, for now, the dragon was in his power, and he could afford a lot, even knowing that then all his power would crumble. By evening, a detachment of townspeople emerged from the forest onto the edge, where there was a flat rocky area framed by thickets of dense bushes. The knights thought this was a convenient place for a camp and declared a stop, instructing everyone to pitch tents. The people recruited from the city, unaccustomed to hiking, wandered around the future camp, not particularly concerned with organizing overnight stays or monitoring the forest. Zeno was outraged that this rabble was no good compared to the trained soldiers. He was afraid to imagine these people in battle. Alita sneered that he, as a noble knight, had simply never seen anything other than the army, and therefore was not aware of the life of ordinary mercenaries. Zeno did not understand her jab, so he replied that it was not for her to speak about nobility, given her pedigree. He and the girl had already turned menacingly towards each other, but Shihan reprimanded the knight that he shouldn't chat in front of other people's ears. It would have been difficult to explain plausibly what Zeno meant, and the boy, realizing his mistake, rushed to apologize. Shihan calmed him down and suggested that he just eat, because he was hungry, and it was right to maintain his strength. Zeno was delighted with this offer, primarily because he rushed to prepare dinner for his commander. While Zenon was busily fussing over the pot, Shuhan asked Alita if they were really going to eat stew again. Alita replied instructively that the stew was very nutritious, which was vital for a soldier, and also quick and easy to prepare. But Shihan already knew that. He was already tired of the stew and wanted something tasty, to which Alita said that food was needed to maintain strength, and not for taste. While the boy and the girl were arguing, they did not notice how Zeno announced that everything was ready for the meal. The comrades approached the pot and saw a wonderful stew that literally radiated appetizingness. After trying one spoonful, Sheehan was delighted and asked again if Zenon had really used ordinary ingredients, while Alita silently gobbled it up. Zeno replied that there was nothing special about this stew, and that he cooked it out of habit, because cooking had become his hobby. The aromas of the dish rose to the night sky, across which white clouds floated, and the company around the fire argued whether Zeno was really a knight or a cook. Alita soon asked for more, and Zeno happily served her another helping, pleased with the high praise from his friends. Sheehan looked at this picture of friendly peace with pleasure. It was much better than when they were teasing each other. But the evening managed to turn sour in an instant when a drop fell on the top of Sheehan's head, followed by dozens of others. The starry sky was overcast, and rain was pouring from the clouds. The crowns of the surrounding trees were rustling, and it quickly became uncomfortable. The militiamen began to set up tents, and the camp became a hustle and bustle. Celton grumbled that it was terrible to be outside in the rain, although he was in the knight's tent, which had been set up in advance and was completely dry. Sheehan also tried to help the tent, and Zeno, hinting that he had warned, replied that it would be difficult to see anything when water was pouring around. Alita asked that, since the cultists were setting demons on their enemies, at least they didn't have to fear attack, since demonic beasts didn't like rain. Zeno noticed that while everyone was rushing around trying to organize shelter for themselves, the camp was practically defenseless. No one was watching the forest. Sheehan replied with a cocky tone and confidence that no matter who controlled the monsters, they were still animals and their instincts could not be suppressed. So the demons won't be able to be forced to attack them during the rain, Sheehan concluded, which made Zeno happy. Then Sheehan listened and mockingly said that the demons had attacked after all. The bustle of the people in the camp was compounded by panicked flight. Many were left without weapons, as they had rushed to hide them under the awnings. From the forest, under the cover of the noise of the rain, giant creatures of incredible shapes emerged, resembling a mixture of toads, fish, crabs, and forest animals. Sheehan, who had once again made a fool of himself, asked in a weak voice if everything in Terranor had really changed so much in 10 years. But the magicians, looking out of the tent, also whispered among themselves in confusion, because only extreme control could force the monsters to attack in the rain. The knight who entered interrupted their whispering and commanded them to join the others and take up battle formation to respond to the attack. Someone experienced from the militia with a curved dagger made his way to one of the monsters and, confident that it was still a stupid beast in front of him, carried out a feint attack. This militiaman was clearly a former mercenary. He had an eye patch, and he acted skillfully. Under the knight's cover, he ripped open the demon's belly, and he fell to the ground and went limp. One Eye felt a sense of victory as he looked around for his next opponent. But this turned out to be reckless, because the monster only lost strength for a short time, it waved its paw, and the mercenary rolled on the ground. The militiamen, who had already managed to kill several monsters, did not understand why the demons were pushing forward with an unusual persistence for beasts. Then a voice came out saying that they were being controlled too well, so every demon would fight to the death. It was Sheehan. He commanded to focus attacks on the nearest demons in order to quickly and reliably disable them. He directed the ranks of the militia and ran with them to give instructions on the spot. One of the knights approached another named Yoldarin and remarked that Sheehan looked interesting, to which the other said that he could be useful. Yoldarin watched Sheehan's actions and had already decided what task he would give him. Sheehan rushed towards the monster, his gaze focused and his movements precise. He managed to get himself a second sword and now struck with double the frequency, charging one of the swords with energy. A few blows and the monstrous lizard fell to the ground, its tongue hanging out on the ground, its dead eye looking up at the sky. The militiamen could be heard asking if this was really the last monster. People were catching their breath and wiping the blood from their faces. Finally, after inspection, it became clear that the enemies were gone, and the camp was filled with jubilation. The warriors raised their weapons into the air. Sheehan carefully counted the corpses of the monsters. There were 44 of them, which meant, according to the intelligence information, they were all the cult's demons. He was still trying to find a clue in his memory as to who and how could control demons so harshly. But this had never happened even during the times of Luslanad. His keen gaze caught a gathering of people near one of the tents. Without showing it, he began to watch and realized that the group of magicians who had been assigned to support the squad were whispering about something. The magicians looked excited and did not seem to share the general joy. Sheehan realized that the cultists were a cover because it was no longer difficult for their squad to catch a gang of unarmed people. Celton, impressed by the demon's attack, now walked meticulously around the camp and threatened everyone that anyone who let down their guard would be punished. The militiamen behind his back grumbled that this unfortunate commander was cowardly hiding behind their backs, and the knights were playing the role of personal guards. Zeno shared this opinion. He felt contempt for Celton after the fight, and Alita agreed with the knight. Shihan suggested that they just ignore him because this man always acts like a selfish person. Zeno was surprised and asked if Shihan knew Celton, to which the guy replied that he knew it from rumors. About Celton, that he was a man with the body of a sage and the mind of a beast. Zeno took this praise as a compliment, and already thought that Celton was worth something. But Shihan noticed that this was a joke, and that this count was as dumb as an animal and as weak as an old man. And in conclusion of this characteristic, he added that the only talent that can be counted is the survivability of a cockroach. Zeno agreed that the world was amazing if such people managed to have the title of count. But Alita, who had been listening silently until now, did not agree. She said that Celton must have some unknown use for someone important, since he had received a high position. The detachment moved off and by the following evening reached the village of Zard, where the people were able to comfortably settle down for the night. In the local town hall, Celton gave a rousing speech of thanks to the fighters and announced that they would complete their mission tomorrow. The militiamen were happy that they would get a tasty dinner and soft beds, so tomorrow seemed easy and cloudless. Shihan looked at this and reminded his comrades that just yesterday the militiamen were grumbling at the command, while Alita and Zenon were placing mattresses on the floor at that time. Shihan lay down on his own and, satisfied, suggested that his comrades rest to their heart's content since such an opportunity presented itself. At this moment, someone called out to Sean Stein, and Shihan opened his eyes with an expression as if he was ready to start killing again. A high-pitched girl's voice asked again if Sean Stein was in the room, and a young girl with red hair and a tabard stood in the doorway. Shihan responded to her and waved his hand so that the searching girl would notice where the voice came from. She came up and introduced herself as Dina Crumble, a student of the Night Foreman, and then asked Shihan to come with her because he was expected. The three comrades looked at each other. Something interesting was brewing, so they all rose to their feet together. The knights were housed in a separate house with richer decoration, similar to a tavern. The girl led the company to the door, but said that she had to warn them first of their appearance, because secret conversations could be taking place inside. She glanced furtively at Alita with genuine interest and poorly concealed envy. Alita noticed this attention but did not understand what was going on, so she only looked back questioningly. In fact, the knight's apprentice saw that Alita was not much older than her, but already had a high rank, and she was filled with admiration for the swordswoman. Finally, they were allowed inside, and Shihan, having previously changed his appearance, entered the room to the knights and asked why they were looking for him. The nearest knight introduced himself as Joldarin, and the mage standing next to him as Kabark. The knight was friendly, while the mage looked distant. Joldarin invited Shihan and his companions to look at the geographical map. It marked their location, and also the place where the cultists were located. The knight reported that the destination was half a day's journey away. Kabark said that the cultists have the ability to control demonic beasts, which Shihan could notice yesterday. Zeno noted that this was the first time the monsters had attacked during the rain, and it was a very remarkable moment. The magician asked if any of the other militiamen had noticed this and how surprised they were. Having received the answer that the others were not so aware of the habits of demons and did not notice the oddity, Kabark asked if his friends could keep it a secret. Shihan took advantage of the situation and immediately asked what they would get for it. It was a good move, because their selfish motives disguised the real ones. Kabark was pleased with this turn of events. Since it was easy to deal with a businessman, he smiled reservedly. 10 gold coins were placed on the table as payment for silence. Zeno was amazed at the price of the secret, and the thought of selling panties flashed through Shihan's mind again. But he reminded himself that this was an exception. Therefore, Shihan also agreed happily and scooped up the coins into his purse. The magician's face again assumed an impassive expression, and he hinted that what he said next was also not intended for prying ears. Kabark said that until a certain time, the cultists did not have magic to control demons. All they had was sacrifices. In the world of Terranor, in addition to magic, which was akin to science and gave precise results, there was also chaotic witchcraft at random with sacrifices. Shihan asked if the demons were really controlled by unpredictable magic. But the magician objected that the source of control was linked to a shameful political history. The fact is that this spell was deliberately developed in the Blue Tower. Hearing this fact, Shihan was surprised and his interest increased. Kabark told about Lactrin Proud, a talented wizard who was engaged in secret research on the 6th floor. However, his overconfidence failed him, and the demonic monsters broke free. This was a fatal mistake. Loctrin was stripped of all titles and sentenced to a 4-element penalty. Zeno asked again, since he had never heard of such a thing before, to which the magician replied that 4 elements were involved in it, and that it was essentially a death sentence. Zeno indignantly asked if they had gone too far with the punishment for a single mistake. Kabark responded sharply that a simple mercenary like himself should not judge matters that did not concern him. Zeno realized that he shouldn't have angered the man, lest the conflict inadvertently force them to open up. So he apologized profusely. The magician demanded that they listen to the end, since they were only being told what was necessary. Loctrin somehow managed to escape before the execution, and he took one of the experimental monsters with him. It was not an easy monster. It had the ability to control other demons. Shihan now realized what was driving the demonic creatures that were relentlessly marching through rain and death. It also turned out that Loctrin's father was a priest of the cult, and that is why this beast entered their service, which is why the cult has risen so much in recent times. Juldarin, who had remained silent until then, ended up saying that destroying the beast and covering up the tracks was the goal of the expedition, and Shihan seemed capable of doing so. Shihan was very flattered by this, and he responded with a playful joke that with magicians and knights, they could even kill a dragon. The magician still answered impartially that Shihan had guessed correctly, and the smile froze on his lips. The cultists had an earth dragon in their hands, and this creature had to be destroyed. Shihan realized that this was not an easy task. He needed to think carefully about how they could complete it. The trio went out to the river to wash their spare clothes, while also having the opportunity to discuss matters away from prying ears. Shihan said that he was not surprised by the gold reward, since the opponent was so serious. And Zeno, seeing his worries, asked if he could refuse. Shihan replied that now that they knew the secret of the Blue Tower, after successfully completing the task, they might try to eliminate them. Zenon and Alita looked at their comrade in surprise, waiting for the continuation of this thought. Shihan thought that they were like naive children because they lived in this fairy tale world. But then Alita confidently objected, and a surprised Shihan looked at her, wanting to hear where she got that from. Alita replied that the sorcerer became angry when Zenon asked why the punishment for Lactrin was so severe, meaning that something was being hidden from them. Besides, even if the mages were going to kill them, they still had no need to reveal secrets. They could only give orders. Zenon was glad that Alita noticed his move in the dialogue, and she replied that she was not a village idiot. Shihan felt ashamed of his arrogance. Zenon asked Shihan if they would carry out the order given by the magician. He replied that he had not yet decided, but the magician had no idea that he was sharing secrets with people with his own interests, and this could help get closer to Yaxengard. Zeno kept trying to persuade the commander to wash his things and at least hang them out to dry, when people approached his friends from behind. The knight accidentally turned around and shuddered. What he saw frightened him, causing Shihan to glance behind him. A group of cheerful women with washing hurried towards them. When the women saw that they were noticed, they began to chatter in turn, addressing the guys on the shore. Coming up close, they pounced with questions about where such handsome men had appeared in their area, whether they were comfortable staying in the village, and other nonsense. Zeno agreed with the women's instructions that it was imperative to gather strength before leaving, and hastened to say goodbye politely, leading his friends away. When they had moved away, he breathed a sigh of relief and whispered that the situation had been awkward, although the village women had been very welcoming. As they left, the trio did not see how these same women were looking at their backs with unkind glances and were only pretending to do their laundry. A dagger which a woman's hand pulled out from a pile of rags glinted in the sun. At full speed after her departing friends, raising her weapon to strike. Alita, who was walking last, heard the approaching footsteps, turned around and instantly got her bearings. It was enough to trip the peasant woman up and send her flying head over heels along the road, while Alita remained firmly on her feet and had already taken a stance. The guys, seeing the woman rolling past them, turned around in confusion and saw an even more amazing sight. A group of women approached them with knives, their faces twisted with rage, their lips whispering curses to all unbelievers. Shihan asked if Alita had sensed something was wrong because she reacted so quickly, but she replied that she had no idea. But then she added that she did not suspect anything special, because she was used to suspecting everyone and always being on her guard. Shihan imagined his friend's thoughts as she interacted with smiling women, while she kept the idea of a knife in her back in her mind. The guys shouted to the women that life is definitely better than death, even if it is the boring life of a village girl. The villagers did not want to listen to them. They hissed that death gives real salvation. It seemed as if they were drugged. Letting out a cry that the heretics must die, the women rushed to the attack. They themselves were like the demonic monsters in the forest the day before. Alita shouted to her comrades that the women had strange eyes, noticing this similarity. 10 seconds later, all the village women were scattered around the area unconscious, and the three comrades were looking around at the carnage. Shahan said that they were definitely not berserkers but just crazy women. He wondered why the assassination attempt was carried out specifically on them, when they should be considered ordinary mercenaries, and there were more priority targets. Then Alita pointed her finger towards the village. Shuhan and Zainan looked where the girl was pointing and saw reddish reflections. From that side, columns of smoke rose. It seemed that the village was engulfed in fires, and soon ash began to fall from the sky. Shihan didn't believe what was happening at first, but he realized that they weren't really the target. On the contrary, their entire squad was attacked. The guy was angry that they had broken away from the rest, doing some ridiculous laundry, because in the village the detachment could have already suffered losses. Then it occurred to him that the cultists had not come to the village. They were the villagers. Their squad had voluntarily walked into the trap. Groups of villagers with pitchforks and scythes ran through the streets in search of the militia, their mad faces distorted with bloodlust. Meanwhile, Yuldurin rushed down the street, cutting into pieces all the enemies that he met on his way. The fanatics died with tears of joy in their eyes, rejoicing that they would get to their god, but the knight did not care about their emotions. He just looked back with disdain at the next madman, amazed at how drugged they were. There was a rumble ahead. It was clearly not the cultists. Yuldurin grouped himself to deflect the blow. Having broken through the fences, a demonic bull as tall as a house was rushing towards him. Yuldurin did not take a single step to escape or dodge. It turned out that, in addition to fanatics, there were also monsters operating in the city. The knight began a ritual to finish off the closest one. He used the iron wall technique, and the bull slammed into the shield of purple light that had grown in front of the knight with all its might. Two more knights came to the rescue. One rushed along the ground, the other made a combat jump. This second one landed on top of the bull, using the annihilation technique and dealing massive damage to the beast. However, the knights immediately saw more monsters coming out from behind the houses. They did not understand where the cult had gotten so many of them from. Kabark, who had joined Yuldurin, informed him that the demons seemed to have come from all over the mountain, and the knight realized that the area of control was simply gigantic. Yuldurin asked if the dragon was older than 500 years, because if so, they were doomed. But Kabark replied that the dragon was only a century old. He explained that the dragon's abilities were disproportionately strong due to magical experiments on him. Yuldurin said rudely that it did not matter whether the creature was so strong because of its age or for some other reason. But Kabark hastened to reassure him that the dragon's power had only grown in the area of his control talents, while his physical strength and survivability had not changed. One of the knights cursed and shouted to the others to look down the street. The monsters, including a mantis and a bear, were heading towards the tavern where the incompetent squad leader Celton was hiding. The bear struck the front wall of the building with its paw and crawled halfway into a room on the first floor. Celton pressed himself against the wall, shaking like an aspen leaf. The two female students with swords continued to cover them, although they were completely confused. Celton, screaming in horror, resembling a girl himself, he reproached the knights for promising him safety in this tavern. He was indignant that the knights had left him here while they went to clean up the streets, and he demanded that the girls rescue him immediately. The red-haired Dina, overcoming her fear, approached the demonic bear with her sword at the ready, expecting a blow at any moment. Suddenly, a blue beam flashed nearby, giving off an irresistible force. Shihan appeared between the girl and the bear with two swords emitting light. Crossing his blades, he directed the power of a magical strike at the monster. Dina felt admiration and relief, and felt safe behind Shihan. Alita and Zenon appeared immediately and dealt with the bear with deft blows, cutting it into pieces. Yuldurin ran up to Shihan. He thanked Shihan for his help and asked if he had seen others. Shihan said that there was fighting all over the village. Yuldurin ordered him to guard Celton, and promised to take care of the monsters with the help of the Knights of the Black Lion. From behind, a shrill voice of an aristocrat was heard, ordering Shihan to take charge of his protection. But even this pig squeal could not drown out the distant and muffled but very powerful sound. Shihan realized that something truly large was moving around in the village, something that made even the demons look mediocre in size. Somewhere on the next street, A green clawed paw landed on the ground, leaving a dent underneath. The dragon's head, towering far above the houses and even the mill, looked over the village, and it was like the palm of the monster's hand. Crimson clouds filled with smoke and ash floated over the village. Fires rose up to meet them, as if trying to reach out and deal with them. Yuldurin finished the fight, and before him lay another giant demonic bear, many times larger than the one that attacked the tavern. He shouted words of encouragement to the other knights. The monsters that had seemed countless before were almost gone. Celton tormented Shihan with his arrogant chatter while the boy listened, trying to at least determine the dynamics of the battle by the sounds. He counted the death cries of the monsters and realized that most of them were not killed, meaning they had simply fled back into the forest. The magicians who fought alongside the knights let out frightened cries. They were the first to see the monster they had not yet fought. The knights turned around and curses poured from their mouths, the only way brave warriors could express their fear without losing their honor. The strength was running out, and the short-lived joy of victory over the hordes of demons evaporated when the black silhouette of the dragon's head loomed like a living tower. The dragon's eyes were burning. He was predatorily looking for victims. Soon all these insignificant creatures would feel the power of his rage if they managed to realize it before death. The dragon opened its mouth and let out a low whistling howl, like the cry of a monstrous seagull. The knights organized the group, the magicians stepped forward. They had to support the defense of the squad. The dragon opened its mouth slightly, but this time to release a dense stream of fire several meters thick. The magicians placed special water shields in front of the squad, which were supposed to neutralize the flames. One of the knights breathed a sigh of relief because the dragon's power had not increased due to the experiments, and they had enough strength to cope. However, there was a complicating circumstance. Everyone was already tired after a long battle with the demons. Yuldurin scolded Kabark for downplaying the problem with his soothing speeches. He pointed to the burning village, showing that the dragon could still bring back his monsters, and Kabark said that the control power could grow a little more. Yuldurin cursed in frustration, as they had no way to force the dragon to fight on their terms. Finally, he realized that all that was left was to inspire his brothers to give their best, and he raised his hand with the sword up. The dragon, seeing that the fire attack had not swept away his tiny opponents, stomped in their direction. Yuldurin stepped forward, putting up his shield. Now it was up to him to hold back the onslaught. The knight used the iron wall technique again to besiege the dragon, and immediately after that, using the destruction technique, he dealt the dragon a crushing blow. The other knights, seeing their comrades single-handedly confronting the most powerful monster, were inspired and rushed to help. They put up their shields of magical energy and stood next to each other so that the shields formed a solid line. Zeno admired what was happening. Unique combat techniques were used here. The dragon was not able to move the formation even a little. Shihan saw the knight's tactics as a style of Yaxengard, who loved frontal attacks, always ensuring that his blow was stronger. He remembered how the rest of his former comrades always got furious when, instead of cleverly defeating an opponent, Yaxengard overpowered him by butting him. Then Shihan came up with an idea. Since the knights were fighting according to the Yaxengard doctrine, it meant that he was still limited by his style, and this could be his weakness. Shihan smiled contentedly. He was confident that he had found the key to future victory. But enough of his thoughts. Shihan decided to go with his friends to help, sensing that the knights would not be able to cope alone. Celton raised a cry that he would be left unguarded and that keeping him safe was an order. Shihan sharply responded that if the knights lost, the dragon would get them and Celton, to which he demanded to cover his retreat. Zeno felt a surge of disgust at the man, and Alita only said that they saw the intelligence of an animal in action. Celton's rage grew louder. Shihan's patience was running out. He was torn between two needs. The friends looked at each other. Someone suggested hitting Celton on the head so that he would lose consciousness, and the rest immediately agreed. Shihan took a sharp step towards the Count, but his expression seemed to betray his intentions. Celton recoiled and said that he saw the mercenaries' desire to attack him. He pushed Shihan and Zenon towards the door, threatening that otherwise he would report them for their disobedience. Celton's face became one of bewilderment. He fell to the floor like a sack of sand, and the girl, standing with a piece of board in her hand, asked sarcastically where this piece of wood could have come from. Dina joked that they had pulled off the perfect crime and suggested that everyone run to help the knights, as their duty demanded. Shahan smiled brightly at the girl, grateful for this service. The knights slashed incessantly with their swords. The smoke mixed with dust, forming a dense cloud around them, but the dragon could not be harmed. The fighters were so tired that they almost fell off their feet. One of them, Level, reacted too slowly due to fatigue, and the dragon's paw rose above him to trample him into the ground. The knight managed to hear the warning and dodge, but the blow to the ground was so strong that he and the magician standing nearby flew apart. Jolderin saw that Level had fallen to the ground unconscious, and the dragon was looking at his body with a predatory expression. Flames began to bubble in the dragon's mouth, foreshadowing a new stream of fire. Shihan's team arrived in time. Alita and Zenon slashed at the dragon's tilted mouth from both sides, and Shihan grabbed Level and dragged him away. A cry of relief escaped from Yolderin's chest. How different it was to see this mercenary who had often appeared at the most necessary moment. After hiding Level, Shihan ran up to Jolderin and said that Celton hit his head on a piece of debris so they could help in the fight. The knight chuckled. Alita was nearby. Blood was pouring from her left hand. Shihan was afraid for his friend and rushed to ask if she was okay. Alita reassured him that there was nothing serious wrong with his hand. It was just that the dragon was too hard. Shihan shouted to the knights that they would not succeed as long as the dragon was covered in natural armor, so they needed to strip off its scales. But the fight took an unexpected turn again. Shihan saw the dragon acting strangely. It turned out that the titan panicked. He rushed about, not paying attention to the knights and missing the blows aimed at him. Very quickly, he turned around and ran as fast as he could from the village towards the mountain, confusing all the participants in the battle. There was a silent scene. Alita froze with a wounded hand. Shihan thought that it was unlikely that the dragon was frightened by his abrupt proposal, since he could not know the language. Here Alita timidly suggested that maybe the dragon was simply terrified of blood, since her wound scared him so much. A few hours later, when the smoke from the fires cleared, the sky became clear again and the rays of the setting sun were visible in it. The captured cultists, tied up in a barn, angrily shouted curses and threats at the unbelievers. One of them shouted to the militiamen on guard that Shihan would come back and save them, to which Shihan thought that he definitely would not do that. He assumed that the expedition against the cult was effectively over, since the bulk of them were either killed or captured. Celton had no recollection of how he had fallen unconscious, and the knight's apprentices had visited him in the hastily constructed hospital. Alita asked what they had been doing here for 3 days if the cult had been crushed and its leaders had fled. To this, Shihan replied that it was useful to neutralize this group of fanatics, but the purpose for which the knights and mages were here remained unfulfilled. It was unclear where Loctrin and his monstrous dragon were. On a calm and clear day, the horrors they faced seemed unreal. However, deep in the forest, in a cave where there were no cultists left and the ritual fire had long since gone out, dark things were happening. Loctrin was breaking out in a cold sweat. He couldn't get the dragon back under his control no matter what he did. The dragon curled up in the depths of the cave and looked unfriendly at the annoying man. Loctrin shouted at the dragon. He even dared to come close to its mouth and almost hit it with his fists, trying to make it move. He couldn't imagine what had happened 4 days ago, that the dragon he needed so much had then hidden in a cave and stopped responding. Loctrin cursed the mages of the Blue Tower. If only they had not sentenced him to death for a single mistake. He dreamed of being like this dragon himself and subjugating everyone he could reach with his will. Loctrin had already accumulated wealth from collecting offerings from the cult, and could afford a luxurious life if not for the need to hide. The former preacher took out his last resort, the ashes of the Laxland clan's hearts, and scattered them near the dragon, giving the command to destroy the squad. But the ash had no effect. The dragon no longer reacted to it. Loctrin ignited the ashes with magical fire. The flames rose up, slightly reaching the dragon. And in this case, there was no reaction. Loctrin, in despair, threw the burning ashes on the floor. Nothing worked. But then the dragon began to stir, and the magician began to doubt with fear that this was a belated result of the ritual. The dragon rose higher and higher. Loctrin, unable to move, simply stood in front of the monster, which now possessed an unpredictable will. Horror gripped the former preacher, because he himself never believed that death brought deliverance. He knew that it was pain followed by emptiness. Loctrin refused to believe that everything had gone to hell. Magic couldn't have left him that much. A blue light flashed on the dragon's nose, a strange mark of unknown origin. The beast opened its mouth. A long, sharp tongue swayed in it. A blue star seemed to be burning on the dragon's face. Clouds of smoke began to come out of its throat. It looked at Loctrin without stopping and was completely free. The magician hid in the corner of the cave and began to beg the dragon, asking him to listen. At the last moment, Loctrin screamed hysterically. The inevitable was approaching him, and he knew what it looked like from the outside. What happened? was what had happened many times before to the chosen fanatics. Blood spurted in all directions. The dragon stalked out of the cave, leaving the mangled body lying in darkness and oblivion. Juldaran and Kabark reached the cave. Their voices echoed under the vaults. They expected to meet demons, but it was empty. Juldaran suggested that they had simply been slaughtered, and Kabark replied that if so, it would be a great relief. The magician began to say something, but suddenly stopped, hearing the crunch of bushes behind him. The Count appeared next to the cave, looking around. Kabark whispered, and asked Juldaran what the hell he was doing here. They whispered that Celton should not know anything about the dragon's origin, and the Count noticed the figures and walked towards them. He again expressed his indignation that his guards were not numerous enough and that he demanded more knights. Juldaran didn't know how to calm this quarrelsome man down so that he wouldn't interfere with their mission. Gathering his composure, he not even very rudely explained that knights were needed to fight the dragon, and the Count should make do with mercenaries. Celton disagreed, and the knight, flaring up in anger, replied that if the Count wanted knights, then let him go with them in search of the dragon. Celton suddenly agreed. He was ready to do anything to be under the cover of the knights. Juldaran was taken aback. He had not made this proposal seriously, and had no idea how he and Celton would be carrying out such a dangerous task. Celton also felt that he had rushed, because when the knights found the dragon, there would definitely be a battle with it. He began to painfully weigh which option seemed less terrible to him, and in the end he confirmed that he wanted to stay with the knights. Juldaran would have been ready to hit him if he had not been an important person with whom his superiors had political dealings. Some time later, Shihan and his comrades reached the cave. He asked Juldaran if this was really the same cave. The knight confirmed. Juldaran said that it was found out during the interrogation using confession magic, but Shihan saw that at first it was just ordinary magic. The magicians cast typical spells on the captives, but this did not work on the hardened madmen. And then the magicians used an unfamiliar black powder, which gave an immediate effect. Shihan thought that perhaps this powder was related to secret experiments. Alita suddenly felt something. A chill ran down her spine. She looked carefully into the darkness of the cave. Inside, two huge predatory eyes lit up, and a thirst for blood poured out of the hole in the rock like a wave. Juldaran, who had recently been exploring the cave with Kabark, was almost taken by surprise, but he commanded the knights to form up. He himself also prepared himself, standing in the front row and peering into the blackness that emitted the smell of burning. The dragon emerged from the hole, and a murmur ran through the knights, wondering if this was the same dragon they had held back earlier. All because the dragon suddenly grew in size. For some terrible reason, its power increased. Juldaran didn't want to allow panic. He smiled unconvincingly and shouted that, whatever the reason, it was nothing. The knight decided to set an example for his comrades and rushed to attack the beast, waving his sword. Kabark also began to cast his spells diligently. He was going to show everyone the level of magical power he could produce when he was not exhausted from many battles. With the support of other mages, he used the cold frost technique, and a wall of icy cold rushed towards the dragon. Two more mages conjured Earth Teeth and Earth Spear, which created razor-sharp rocks that flew at the monster like projectiles. The dragon was focused on the knights in front of him. It seemed he was still deciding whether to trample them, burn them, or tear them with his teeth. Zeno admired the tactics of the knights and mages, and Shihan agreed with him, suggesting that intervention would not even be necessary. But, as usual, it was at this very moment that everything went wrong, and Shihan saw how his words turned out to be a mistake. Ribbons of green light swirled around the dragon, and the powerful magical attacks directed at it dissolved without a trace. The magicians, seeing this, lost their composure and their spells began to fade from loss of concentration. It wasn't that the dragon withstood the blow, but that the blow simply disappeared. This had only happened before when fighting creatures summoned from other worlds. The dragon, which had not attacked before, as if wanting to demonstrate its invulnerability, now released a stream of flame. It was filled with hot boulders that crashed into the ground like meteorites, causing enormous destruction. The ground caught fire from this breath. The flames spread for tens of meters. The knights were engulfed in flames, as were the magicians. Only one was able to dodge and fled. Juldaran was able to shield himself from the fiery storm, but his two less powerful comrades lay unconscious. With one blow, the dragon had almost deprived them of all fighting potential. Juldaran was feverishly thinking about what to do next. The three knights still stood in position simply because that was what knights were supposed to do, but the plan needed to be changed radically. Shihan, Zenon, and Alita were covering Celton, who was cowering in panic. From the flames, They also understood that they needed to hurry to help. Shihan felt the heat and realized with horror that, just like that electric wolf, the dragon was capable of harming him. This thought was hard to get used to. The guy looked around the battlefield, looking for people still fighting. 2 knights and 4 mages lay unconscious. The remaining mage was useless against the monster. All they had were 3 knights, whom the dragon was now beating with its paws, so far only hitting their shields. Shihan realized that he had no choice but to give it his all, even if it meant being recognized. His sword once again glowed with a blue light. Heralding the imminent release of powerful magical energy, Shihan rushed to the rescue. As he approached the dragon, a tornado of blue flashes was already circling around him, ribbons of lights flying in different directions in spherical waves. Alita watched what was happening, fascinated, and quietly whispered Shihan's name. Zenon also watched without looking away, and the sight frightened him. He recognized the rituals, because over the years of worshipping the savior, Zeno had managed to learn all the details about his fighting skills. The tornado swirled around Shihan faster and faster, the 2 swords in his hands drawing intricate patterns, weaving patterns of light. Taking off from his place, he flew forward with the power of magic. This was the technique of conquering the heavens. The dragon had already turned away from the knights, who were trying to somehow cover their wounded, and was also watching this new creature, exuding so much power. Flying towards the dragon's head, Shihan swung his sword. But it was not the weapon that struck, but a huge blade of pure light that pierced the dragon's cheek. The knights gasped as they watched the simple mercenary Sean single-handedly challenge the monster that their entire group had been unable to defeat. Alita also gasped when the light blade hit the dragon. Zenon told her about the technique that Shihan created to defeat the Emperor's monsters. Shihan, however, remained stern. In fact, he was dissatisfied inside and continued to swing his sword. He was angry that he couldn't defeat the dragon with one blow. This happened because the amount of available energy was still low. All that was left was to continue to strike, which Shihan did, so quickly that the dragon froze, engulfed in the storm pressing on him from all sides. The knights talked to each other in fascination. They couldn't believe their eyes and wondered who this man could be. Yuldurin admitted to his comrades that there was one thing they knew for sure. Shihan, who had previously appeared to be just an experienced and talented swordsman, was secretly much stronger than the knights themselves. Zeno and Alita decided that Shihan might need their help and rushed forward, abandoning the useless Keltron. He was terribly frightened by the fact that he was left without protection, but the sight distracted even him from his fear. He was no longer a boy, and therefore he knew and remembered a lot. He learned combat techniques that were now directed against the dragon. The dragon was angry. He had never suffered such severe damage before. He spun around and lashed his tail at the ground, sending sharp shards flying out of the rock and towards the people. Zenon and Alita, who were already running up to the battlefield, were forced to slow down and take cover from the rockfall. Shihan shouted that the dragon was clearly no slouch. Now the magic danced on his swords like blue flames. Meanwhile, the dragon wasted no time. Fire began to bubble in his mouth, escaping from between his teeth. The creature shot a stream of flame at Shihan, who was hanging in the air nearby, and it was impossible to dodge from such a close distance. One of the knights shouted at Shihan to save himself because the dragon used all its strength to attack. A stream of flames engulfed Shihan, pushing him higher into the sky with its pressure. For a moment, Shihan remembered how the wolf managed to electrocute him. If his talent didn't work now, this stream of fire would end his life. He once again strengthened his sky conquest technique, directing himself downwards towards the fire. And having flown closer, he used the rumble of the mountains, and its onslaught cut through the previously dense stream of fire, scattering it in different directions. Alita and Zeno were illuminated by flashes of scattering flames. The guy was delighted by the power of Shihan, and the girl was simply amazed. And Shihan finally used another technique, Dragon Sword Energy, and his swords were entangled in spirals of blue lightning. Shihan landed on the dragon's head and stabbed those swords straight through its scales and skull deep down. And after that, the final blow was dealt by the 1,000 explosions technique. A column of discharges grew on the dragon's forehead, scattering everything in all directions. Blood gushed from everywhere on the dragon, from his mouth, eyes, and ears, and with a silent cry, he staggered and fell to the side. The monster's face seemed to express a sense of helplessness from the encounter with superior power, and its body lay sprawled on the ground. Shihan landed on the back of the defeated monster. He was pretty exhausted in this battle, but he succeeded. Silence reigned among the people. The knights' apprentices silently put their hands to their mouths, which were open in amazement, and came to their senses. The experienced magicians were no less amazed. Everyone just stood and waited for something. Shihan looked around the battlefield with a dejected expression. He was sure that his cover had come to an end. Kabark was the first to speak. He began to speak, but hesitated. Finally, he told Shihan that he had fought magnificently and that slaying a dragon alone was something incredible. Shihan was surprised that this was the first thing he was told, since for the savior, killing a dragon could be considered a routine matter. The knights came up and started praising his fighting ability. They were as delighted as boys. Shihan began to suspect that no one understood anything. The savior was so forgotten that even such a blatant display of fighting style did not make them recognize him. Shihan didn't even know whether to be happy or sad about such a blow to his pride. In any case, he was glad that the people survived. He walked on and Yuldurin came out to intercept him. He looked stern, and it was clear that he wanted an explanation from Shihan. Yuldurin stated that Shihan had concealed his true level of skill and that his skills were on par or even superior to the Black Lion Knights. The Knight Commander asked the reason for the secrecy and the purpose of pretending to be an ordinary mercenary. Zaynan ran up and apologized, saying that Shihan had been training in goals for a long time, but had no combat experience, so he started from the bottom to gain some. Zeno asked to understand that it was normal for mercenaries not to talk about their abilities, and the knights looked from one guy to the other. It came as a surprise to them that the stern and courageous Zenon, with his weathered face and scars, turned out to be younger than Shihan with his well-groomed appearance. Yuldurin said that this explained why Zenon, who was a knight, was so courteous to the renowned swordsman warrior, knowing of his talents. Zeno confirmed that defeating the dragon was nothing more than a combination of honed skills and great luck, while Shihan pretended to be a fool. However, Yuldurin made a small bow, paying tribute to such powerful talents. The knight was glad to have met these people. He promised that he would definitely reward Shihan and his friends, and then headed to the others to help the wounded and collect the dead. Shihan breathed a sigh of relief and thanked Zenon, whose cunning had once again helped him in a difficult situation. Zono replied that he couldn't let the cover that had taken so much effort perish, especially since he had to limit himself in the fight with the dragon as well. Alita just approached them. She heard the last words. She asked Shihan in a whisper if Zenon knew about the loss of power, to which the guy replied that after the betrayal of friends, she would not blab either. Once the danger had passed, Shihan's bravado returned, and he said that even though he had risked using his style, no one would have recognized him. Alita pointed her finger to the side and asked Shihan if he was sure that this man didn't understand either. There, separately from everyone else, stood Celton. Alita noticed that despite his vices, he was quite observant. On one hand, Celton had the usual frightened look, but there was some understanding in his gaze as he looked at Shihan. Shihan thought it was becoming a bad Alita tradition to disprove his words, but it was much worse if Celton actually understood everything. After a short time, their squad built a stretcher for their fallen comrades and was able to head back to the village. Only the dragon remained lying on the battlefield. When the squad returned, Dina was in for a grief-stricken situation. As her mentor was among those injured in the battle, she cried and asked him in vain to wake up. Another knight was also seriously wounded, and 4 mages died from that fatal fire blast. Lachran's body was found in the cave, and he and the dragon were burned with magical fire to completely erase all traces. Shihan continued to investigate the phenomena that he did not understand. He thought that some monsters disappeared after death, and some did not. One of the wolves disappeared and the other remained. And it was unclear what the difference was and what the reason for the disappearance was. All the surviving participants of the expedition spent the night in an empty cultist village in order to set off on their return journey the next morning. When it got dark, there was a knock on the door of the room where Celton spent the night, and the aristocrat was naturally frightened. Shihan appeared behind the door and said with an ominous smile that they needed to talk. Celton stood in the doorway, not rushing to let the visitor in and trying to come up with a plausible excuse. He said that of course they could talk. But what kind of question arose at such a late hour? And maybe it would be better to rest before tomorrow's journey. Shihan realized that his interlocutor was dodging and decided to press harder. He pretended loudly to ask Celton again which savior from another world he was talking about. Celton began to sweat. He realized that he had been found out and that it was better not to cheat. Shihan smiled maliciously and said openly that Celton's reaction was the best proof that he understood everything. A minute later, they were settled in a corner of Celton's bedroom, which was poor but beautiful and clean, and the aristocrat asked if his guess was true. They sat at the table, and Shihan answered in the affirmative, wondering how Celton was able to figure this out even without being a swordsman. Keltrin replied that they had crossed paths in person several times 10 years ago, but he doubted it since Shihan's energy level was lower now. He asked why Shihan had come secretly and hidden his identity. Keltrin thought of the 6 emperors who would be the first to know of their old friend's arrival. It is unlikely that this is an attempt to avoid annoying fans. The level of secrecy is much higher. This meant that Shihan was afraid of something or someone in Terranor. Keltrin suddenly uttered the phrase enemies in Terranor, Orish, which ended his thoughts. Shihan's eyes widened. The guy asked what enemies Keltrin was talking about. The aristocrat hesitantly began to explain that after Shihan returned home, there were rumors that he had been driven out by force. Most people did not believe it. They thought it was a fairy tale, since betraying the savior would be a great stupidity. Keltrin said he remembered this when he put it all together in his head just now, and Shihan thought that Keltrin was suddenly being insightful. He was able to put together all the details and described the events that took place. Shihan even doubted whether it was fair to attribute the insulting characterization of animal intelligence to Keltrin. He asked what Keltrin would do if the rumors were true. Keltrin fidgeted. He had no prepared answer for this, and he couldn't immediately figure out what words Shihan wanted to hear. He tried to reassure himself that Shihan and Jacksongard were friends, so he shouldn't be in any danger. But then he realized that if Shihan intended to take revenge, Jacksongard was one of the targets, and Keltrin realized that calm was premature. Finally, Keltrin wondered why Shihan hadn't yet begun his revenge. Was he not strong enough to deal with the 6 emperors? And then the thought struck him that if Shihan was truly not ready to take open revenge, he might not spare Keltrin so as not to take risks. The aristocrat fell to his knees and began to beg Shihan for mercy. The guy didn't even immediately manage to grasp what had happened. Keltrin bowed and lamented about his sick old mother and the 3-year-old child who would be an orphan without him. Shihan wondered what kind of child they could be talking about if Keltrin was not married, and that the animal's mind was now at full strength. The meaning of the nickname was that Keltrin lost his head at any slightest danger, and all his clear mind turned out to be useless. Shihan understood why Keltrin had not caught his eye during the fight against Luslanad 10 years ago. The guy tried to calm his interlocutor, assuring him that he had not intended to kill him, and that now he was also not in any danger. Keltrin shed a tear and was effusive in his gratitude, promising to be helpful and not to tell Jacksongard anything. Shihan replied that it was not that simple, because he could not simply take Keltrin's word for it. In Shihan's hand, streams of magic swirled like blue smoke. Keltrin babbled, trying to ask what it meant. Shihan moved his hand lightning fast towards Keltrin's chest, causing a blue flash to pass through him and fly out of his back. Keltrin didn't have time to get scared. He reflexively grabbed his chest, but it didn't hurt, and he only asked what Shihan did. The guy sternly replied that it was the explosive aura technique, blue light still flying off his hand. Keltrin had heard about the explosive aura, and at first he was overcome with horror. This technique was said to be one in which the savior placed a portion of the magical energy associated with a person inside him and could cause an explosion at any moment. Shihan said that although this skill can only work with 3 people at a time and they don't have to be swordsmen, it is extremely useful. He said that Keltrin's life was now in his power, and he would only lift the spell when he could trust the Count. Keltrin sat on the floor, disconcerted, holding his chest and remaining silent. Then he breathed a sigh of relief as if a stone had fallen from his shoulders. He smiled and told himself that he was alive. Shihan initially thought that Keltrin was not afraid of his explosive aura for some reason. His reaction seemed so carefree. He reminded him that if Keltrin betrayed him, he would die a painful death. But the Count replied that he was not afraid because he did not intend to betray. The only thing that threatens him is if something makes Shihan think that Keltrin is a traitor, and then the punishment will be undeserved. The Count declared that he was now Shihan's humble servant and was ready to carry out any of his instructions. The boy was shocked by such a quick decision. He asked if Keltrin felt no doubts or pangs of conscience about renounce the Emperor in his favor. To this, Keltrin replied only that there was no doubt in the choice between the savior and the destroyer of the earth. Keltrin looked calm, and his words sounded sincere. It seemed that the savior's authority was really high for him. When Shihan left the house, it was already dark night. The moon was not shining, and in the light of the stars he walked through the garden. As he left the courtyard, he passed through the wooden gate. Shihan was looking for someone with his eyes. Here, behind the trees, Alita was waiting for him. Noting that she saw that the conversation had gone well, Shihan thanked her for her help. Alita stood guard the whole time and was supposed to warn if there were strangers nearby. Alita seemed to be peeping. She said with admiration that despite the small amount of energy, Shihan was able to use explosive aura. Shihan waved his hand dismissively and said that this skill simply did not exist in reality. The guy replied that it would be too cool even for him to be able to blow people up remotely, so it was just intimidation. Alita indignantly said that even the books wrote about this skill, to which Shihan replied that this was what was intended. Alita stood there pouting as if she had been laughed at for dragging out the prank for a decade, and Shihan said that they now had a big trump card. But he is still tormented by questions about the origin of the dragon and the igneous wolf, which had qualities as if they were summoned from another world. He suggested that these animals were the experimental animals in the Blue Tower. Alita said that she too was tormented by thoughts about what was happening on this trip. When they were present at the interrogation and Kabark used the mysterious black powder, something happened. Shihan said that he had no idea what this powder could be or what kind of magic was involved. Alita shook her head and said that she actually wanted to tell him something. When the powder was applied, she felt like there were dozens of insects crawling inside her, and it was terrible. Her gaze was full of sadness from this memory. Shihan did not interrupt her, but the girl remained silent. Looking at the starry sky, she said she didn't know how to explain it. Something about the powder that lay in the magician's hand awakened vague memories or visions. A dark-haired mage in red clothes holds powder, and figures of prisoners bow before him. All of this made her cry. An emaciated woman was chained to the wall. A dark figure stood in front of her with a sword dripping with blood. Lilstein demanded that the next man come forward. Something glowed in the magician's hand. Another prisoner appeared, overgrown, bearded, and dirty. Lilstein, clutching a glowing black powder, commanded the man to kill himself. The bearded man grabbed the sword and brought it to his neck, preparing for the move that would end his life. The prisoner's eyes were clouded, but the sword trembled in his hands. The prisoner could not do this. A tangible struggle was taking place inside him. The bearded man woke up. He didn't understand where he was and what was happening. Fear was visible in his already living eyes. He found himself with a sword at his throat, standing in front of a woman chained to a wall. The man could only whisper a few words to the woman. He called her darling and asked what he had done. Blood splattered, adding a fresh stain to the floor already covered in crimson streaks. An angry Lilstein stood over the bearded man's body, his subjects continuing to resist some of his orders, although the powder could no longer be made better. The magician snapped his fingers. The chamber needed to be cleared for further experiments, and magic was the fastest way. The dead body caught fire, the magical flame quickly turning the remains into ash, which flew away through the ventilation ducts. Lilstein realized that achieving the results he was aiming for was much more difficult than it initially seemed. Jacksonguard's palace was very far from the gloomy dungeons, both in terms of distance and in terms of the atmosphere that reigned there. The Emperor listened to the story about the results of the campaign and reacted very vividly when Jacksonguard was told about the dragon. He perked up. Celton told him that 2 knights had died from wounds received in the battle, but overall the campaign had fully accomplished its objectives. Celton didn't mention a word about the dragon being anything but simple and having some connection to the Blue Tower. The monster looked quite natural among the cultists, but Jacksonguard still thought about the dragon. He was hurt that he could not defeat the monster himself, and loudly regretted that he listened to Celton. The Count apologized, but realizing that what had been done could not be changed, Jacksonguard forgave his beloved subordinate. The knight captain asked Julderin what rumors were circulating about the fighters who had played a special role in the battle. Julderin replied that there really were such, and their skill was so high that he wanted to invite them into the order. Celton managed to hire these fighters as his personal guard. The captain said that he too had been counting on reinforcements, but added contemptuously that since these people were only interested in money, then so be it. Celton listened with an awkward smile as Julderin disputed the captain's view that Shihan and his friends were simply mercenaries without honor. After reporting to the Emperor, Celton returned to his luxurious mansion, so pompous that it could be called a palace. But here another report was waiting for him. This time, to Shere Khan, Celton put his home at his disposal. He was ready to do anything to save his life. The trio were also given separate quarters outside the palace and were officially enrolled in the service with a salary. Shihan noticed that the fake service was so convincingly faked that the 3 of them could only kneel before the Count. Celton felt uneasy. He said that he was not ready for this because even giving them orders in public already scared the hell out of him. However, despite his fear, Celton seemed to want to know something. With a trembling voice, he began to talk from afar, trying to find out if Shihan's revenge included killing Jacksonguard. Shihan was surprised that Celton would even think he would do such a thing. He even laughed, but even laughter made the cowardly Count tremble. Keltron wanted clarity about what lay ahead for him in the future. Shihan said good-naturedly that Jacksonguard did not deserve to die, even though he had trampled on the trust earned in dozens of battles side by side. But he only sent Shihan home, although he could have done it in parts. Shihan confidently said that he did not plan to kill Jacksonguard, although he looked ominous at that moment. The ruins of the castle were littered with the sagging banners of the Laxland family, and the smoke from the battle rose into the sky. The knights who took part in the siege rejoiced. The castle of one of Luslanad's closest relatives had fallen. A fair-haired guy was sitting by a field fire, thinking about something with a regretful look. His face was refined. He looked more like a poet than a warrior. Then someone called out to a guy named Saffron. Jacksonguard called his comrade to celebrate the victory with everyone. Their army had taken another big step towards overthrowing tyranny. Saffron replied that their victory was undeserved and asked who was the owner of the castle. Jacksonguard replied that the castle belonged to Luslanad's half-brother, Prince Grass, if he was not mistaken, and joked that he was unhappy when he died. Saffron said that Grass was indignant because of the betrayal. The emperor did not send help to his relative, and if it were not for this, now everything would be different. The guy tried to explain to Jacksonguard that the emperor had killed his competitor with the help of the rebels, and they found themselves in the role of someone else's tool. Jacksonguard admitted that kinship was worthless in the face of lust for power, but they must rejoice in the victory for they needed it. Saffron said that Jacksonguard was not very far-sighted, to which the hero cheerfully replied that Saffron should have bothered himself less. Saffron was upset by this misunderstanding and continued to look sullenly ahead. He tried to ask Jacksonguard if he had been thinking about something, but he didn't have time to finish because his friend immediately answered no. He didn't need to listen to the end of the question, since he believed that everything Saffron was thinking about was far-fetched. Jacksonguard said that it was Saffron's job to think, and his job was to swing the sword. Saffron smiled, even though Jacksonguard was turning it all into a stupid joke. He was a good guy. Jacksonguard what he thought would happen after the emperor fell, and he replied that, of course, peace would come. But Saffron said that someone would have to become the new king, and I wonder who it would be. Jacksonguard confidently replied that it would definitely be Song Shihan, because he was powerful and had no intention of going home. Saffron said it was a logical assumption, but there were complications with it. Because if so, will Shihan's allies agree to become his subordinates? Will they be able to maintain his friendship? Jacksonguard felt uneasy at this question. Their friendship seemed to him to be something unshakable, independent of anything. And Saffron added that Grass, who was Luslanad's most faithful ally, was betrayed and left without a head. That's why Saffron thought about what would happen when they had to share power. It seemed that this question, along with the smoke, began to hover over the ruins. Jacksonguard opened his eyes. He was lying on the ground, covered with a thin layer of hay. The emperor could sleep not only on downy feather beds. It was a training yard where Jacksonguard practiced his skills, and he realized that Saffron and those long-ago events had appeared to him in a dream. 10 years had passed, but some moments still came to mind, whether he wanted them to or not. Jacksonguard sat down, tucking his legs under him. He knew that he had not become a sage after all these years, but now he wanted to know the answer, whether he had stood on the right side. Then the emperor heard screams. Someone was breaking through to him, forcefully pushing away the servants. There were no guards here, since the emperor was able to stand up for himself. But this man posed a different kind of threat. A young man with long hair and a rich suit ordered the servants to leave and said that he would deal with Jacksonguard himself. Then he burst into the courtyard, throwing open the double gates, his expression expressing indignation. Jacksonguard greeted the young man named Ains wearily and asked him what was the matter. Ains brazenly asked why the construction of a new palace at an insane cost had begun when there was enough space for concubines in the existing ones. Jacksonguard replied with a smile that the heating in the southern flower palace had broken down and that his cat should live in luxury. Ains said that Jacksonguard was no less tyrannical than the previous emperor, since even in difficult times he threw people into a useless construction project. The young man fell silent and a hard expression froze on his face as he looked into Jacksonguard's face. The emperor stopped smiling, and in a tone that brooked no argument, he said that Ains had gone too far. Despite his outward steadfastness, Ains was afraid, but the emperor said that this time he would let him go. Jacksonguard turned to the boy and said that some things could not be forgiven, even to a son. The emperor demanded that his son repeat what he had just said, and the young man became embarrassed. He stubbornly pressed his mouth shut, but it was clear that he was having difficulty meeting his father's gaze. Eins blurted out that the workers were overloaded. The work schedule was unbearable, the people were indignant and cursing Yaxengard. The young man muttered that, looking at this, one could not see the difference between the new order and the tyranny of the former emperor. Yaxengard hated being compared to Lustlanad, and those around him seemed to conspire to do so out of spite. He shouted loudly at his son to stop talking immediately, and that he had forgotten his place in speaking there, although he himself had not seen the human grief of those times. The scream and the step forward taken by his father frightened Eins so much that he recoiled. Jacksengard looked reproachfully at his son, who plopped down on the floor, unable to withstand the psychological pressure. More calmly, he told Eins to stop wasting his time and go on his way. The Emperor's frowning face did not allow for any objections. Eins didn't dare look up and face his father. He muttered that he had to speak out, and then apologized. Accompanied by a commanding gaze, the prince silently and awkwardly rose to his feet, turned, and walked away past the servants who were still bustling about. Jacksengard smacked his lips in displeasure. He thought that he had raised a son who was not strong-willed enough, who could not even defend his opinion. What did he know, this brat, when he was not even 10 years old? The former emperor executed his parents, brothers, sisters, and even his beloved Yaxengard, the only relative of the current emperor, and such a disappointment, because he didn't even have the talent of a swordsman. Jacksengard thought the prince was thin and fragile in character, while at that age he was an expert in combat. He thought that he had made a mistake in his upbringing somewhere. Perhaps he had spoiled his only son too much. Celton had always been proud of his mansion and wanted its glittering splendor to show everyone the true level of the count's influence and wealth. Compared to this mansion, the four-story house looked like a pitiful extension. But it was in this unremarkable building that Shihan and his friends lived. However, Celton did not skimp on the interior decoration. Stucco and painting, chandeliers and candelabra, expensive furniture, everything was filled with chic. The trio looked around the house with great interest. They had never lived like this before, and Shihan saw that the house even had a secret passage built in it, which he had asked for. Celton was present and respectfully showed where everything was. He explained that the house was built for the future. Celton said that he was not yet married and therefore had prepared the house in advance, but his interlocutors did not quite understand the logic. Shihan sternly remarked that kidnapping people was a very bad idea, but Celton quickly replied that that was not what he had meant at all. He replied that the house was built as a shelter in case he was accused of disloyalty, and the family would need to be hidden. Zeno boasted that he put his house up for sale and was able to sell it for much more than he bought it for. Shihan told him that the money should last for a long time. Celton hastened to remind about himself, hinting that he could also help in financial matters. He assured Shihan that he could ask for any help. All this time, he addressed the guy only with the words "sir." Shihan hadn't experienced such treatment for a long time, and he smiled. It seemed like life was starting to get better. He and Alita went out for a walk in the garden in front of the house. Shihan said that he was grateful to his friend for the advice. It was Alita who suggested to Shihan that he demand an official appeal from Celton, which had great effect. She said that when Shihan used informal language with her, he was showing that they were equal, but Celton needed to be shown something completely different. Shihan was puzzled as to why Alita was so interested in the effectiveness of their influence on the Count. Alita looked away thoughtfully and said that before she really didn't care much about the success of their plan. But now something had changed. Shihan was curious and asked what the girl was talking about. She answered evasively that, in fact, it was nothing important, and asked whether she and Zenon should now officially contact Shihan. The guy calmly replied that he wanted to maintain a friendly tone, so he didn't want such changes in their communication. Alita seemed pleased with the recognition of her status as a friend, and she thanked Shihan kindly. She then asked him for what purpose he invited her here. Since it wasn't just for the sake of idle chatter, Shihan remembered what he wanted to propose. He said that the girl could try to supplement her specialization and start studying magic in addition to martial arts. Shihan said that the girl had an affinity for magic and potential, as she became his summoner, albeit unwittingly. Alita hesitated. She always considered herself just a swordswoman, and learning magic was unlikely to be available to her. Supplementing combat techniques with magical attacks looked promising, but getting into the ivory tower with its origins was impossible. Shihan smiled in his traditional arrogant manner and said that they didn't need any tower. The guy solemnly declared that he was not only a master swordsman with the rank of a deity, but also a 9th-level mage with the rank of a master. The breeze rustled the crowns of the fruit trees. Shihan was starting his next lesson, intending to start from the basics. Alita hoped that this time the lesson would be a success. Shihan began to talk about the three components of the magical ritual, which began with the language of runes, which collected magical energy. The second stage was a spell that transformed the energy into something concrete. A fire ignited in his hand. The final third step was the command that what had been created by the spell began to act, and the fire shot out of the hand and into the ground. Pleased with his demonstration, Shihan showed Alita the scorched grass and waited for her reaction. When she didn't wait, he tried to console her with the words that, with training, it would stop being difficult, and began shooting fire from his hands around himself. He also added that even geniuses cannot remember all the spells, so there is an indispensable tool in this matter. Shihan extended his empty hand to Alita, who looked closely at his palm but saw nothing. Then, a ghostly book appeared out of thin air. It was a book of spells, into which the magician could write down everything necessary from memory, and from it, the path began. Alita replied that she had spoken to many magicians but had never seen such a book. Shihan replied that he showed it on purpose. Usually the book is invisible, but sorcerers stretch out their hands in front of them specifically to leaf through it. This pose even received its own name, handprint or somatic. Alita nodded understandingly. Shihan gleefully remarked that this book had helped him pass many exams when he was in college. Alita was amazed and asked again if there was really no magic on Earth, and Shihan confirmed that this was the case. The girl noticed that Shihan continued to use magic at home, that is, in the other world everything works, they just don't use it for some reason. Shihan said he never thought about how this happened, but it is indeed an interesting topic. He assumed that he felt his magic when passing through the portals, and the rest of the Earthlings did not have this chance. Alita said with admiration that this meant that on Earth, Shihan was even greater because he had no competitors at all. The guy was surprised by her enthusiasm, and she began asking an unexpectedly large number of questions. Then his friend said another one. She wanted to know how he lived these 10 years in his homeworld. Shihan froze after these words. It seemed like he withdrew into himself. Alita even called him by name again. The guy looked down. It was not easy for him to start speaking. He squeezed out the first word. In those moments, memories flew before his inner gaze. His hometown, high-rise buildings and monuments. Car traffic so dirty and noisy but necessary to the city like blood to the body. Passers-by going wherever they wanted, on business or idly hanging around near shops. One day they happened to see a very unusual sight. A completely naked guy lying on a stone slab in the middle of the square. It was unclear where he came from. Some wondered who he was. Others shamed him. Someone even complimented his physique, while someone else covered someone else's eyes so that he wouldn't stare at the obscenities. Shihan lay on the cold stone, and before his eyes were still his friends and traitors at the same time. At the police station, even the officers pointed at him, asking if he was the weirdo who was lying naked on the street. Shihan was given a police uniform to put on to cover himself. They had already identified him and were gossiping that his parents' divorce could have pushed him into a binge. The police officer demanded to know where Shihan had been and what he had been doing since he was reported missing. Shihan stared blankly ahead and replied only that he knew nothing. In vain did the policeman try to demand that he not lie. It seemed he was going to interrogate him with prejudice. At this point, a blue light flashed in the policeman's eye and immediately went out, and understanding appeared on his face. The officer said it looked like amnesia and instructed the boy to see a doctor. Shihan looked at his face and smiled. He had just successfully used magic, and it was encouraging. But he decided to keep it a secret and get out of the station as soon as possible. While the paperwork was still going on, evening was already approaching, and he didn't even know which station he was in. The police got hold of some clothes from somewhere and gave them to him, and Shihan left the station through the front doors. Here, he looked up and realized where the clothes he was now wearing came from. There was a car parked in front of the entrance, and Shihan's father was standing next to it. It looked like the return home was going to be as painful as possible. Shihan turned to his father with hope, who stood there and looked at the son he had found with a disdainful gaze. They arrived home to an apartment on the upper floors of an ordinary high-rise building in a residential area of the city of Daejeon. The father scolded Shihan, asking where he had been for 7 years. But without waiting for an answer, he again showered him with reproaches that he had not even gone to school. Shihan looked at his father and saw that after so many years and shocks he remained the same as he was, quarrelsome, always grumbling about his good name. The father continued to lament about the disgrace he had committed at Guanhuaman Square, which had already become the laughingstock of the entire internet. Shihan didn't expect warmth or sympathy, but even so, the reception was too cold. The guy looked around with pleasure. He had already begun to miss his homeworld, which seemed faded after Terranor. He understood that he missed the internet, television, air conditioning, household appliances, but not his home. His father was his eternal overseer, looking mercilessly from above through glasses, as if through a mask hiding everything human. His father said that he would send his son to a special school in the capital so that Shihan could catch up with his curriculum and have a chance to enter college. It was supposedly necessary for Shihan to turn into a decent person. The boy obediently agreed and stood up to leave. His father shouted at his back that if he failed to enter, Shihan would be better off disappearing again for many years. The guy tried to drown out these words in his head. He didn't want to believe that they had even been spoken. He spent so many years trying to free another world from tyranny, and as a reward he received this, indifference and contempt. A fire burned inside Shihan. He wanted to find a way to return at any cost. It wasn't supposed to end this way. His hatred for the traitors will become his fuel that will drive him to his goal. He will call them to account. Days dragged on. Warm ones were replaced by cold ones, clear ones by cloudy ones. For a year, Shihan tried to live the life of a schoolboy, and at the same time, look for a way back. He attended a special school, but he put all his efforts not into lessons but into mastering the deepest aspects of magic. His spell book contained many records of complex spells and also made it possible to easily pass the entrance exams. Even the father became less strict. It seems that now the concern about the reputation of their family has become less strong. But Shihan didn't care. Once he entered university, he no longer intended to live with his father. Suho Shihan told his father that he didn't have to worry about him. He was able to take care of himself. The father was furious, and the offspring managed to ruin everything, the only moment when everything went as it should. He threatened that Shihan might not even think of coming back to ask for help, but his son had already left the house without even looking back. Shihan was indignant at how disdainfully they treated him, how they did not believe in his strength, and yet he was now worth much more. He was unique. He could turn his world upside down because he possessed a power that no one could counter. Shihan easily got himself money for living and settled in a decent apartment. He bet on races and helped the right horse win by channeling his fighting energy into it. A year of magic tricks, and Shihan could no longer think about money, looking out over the city from his apartment through the floor-to-ceiling window. During this time, Shihan managed to learn how to open portals to other dimensions, but these portals were uncontrollable. These portals led to unknown places, and he could not get somewhere at will, and going at random was akin to flying through space. Even if he set out on a journey, opening more and more windows, he might never find Terranor among the myriad realities. Shihan was wandering in the darkness of the unknown. Nothing more could be extracted from the records, and personal experiments yielded no results. The search for Terranor could take 10 years, or it could take a lifetime, and the desire to return began to rust. He had doubts about whether he should have hated his former friends so much, since they had only brought him home. He gradually began to justify them, to believe that everything had not turned out so bad, given his current situation. Shihan decided that he had forgiven them, forgiven his friends, forgiven Lavina, after all. Relationships with girls are always fickle. He accepted the thought that he would not be able to return. This thought, like a drop that forced all the liquid to pour out after it, deprived him of the strength to resist. For 7 years after that, he tried to live a normal life and find his place in his native world. After all, he studied at the university. He made friends among his classmates, but now he avoided close relationships, so he led a solitary lifestyle. After university, Shihan served in the army, which even made him forget the terrible pages of life in Terranor, replacing them with new ones. From time to time, Shihan would think that if he had magic, he could make his world a better place. But how did Terranor repay him for such aspirations? His native world was full of life. He lived in a beautiful city, but he was unhappy and no amount of action could fix the situation. One day during training, a moment of truth happened. He felt it, and didn't even immediately understand what it was. But he knew that it was more important than anything in the world. As he walked on the treadmill, he listened to the sensations of a hunting dog sniffing after finding a trail. As usual, Shihan was going through the directions to open the portal, and somewhere among the many realities, something familiar sounded. Could it be that he had sensed the magical energy of Terranor? He couldn't believe it. But he tried to reproduce this direction again and again so as not to forget. Shihan jumped to the floor and ran headlong away from unnecessary witnesses. Nothing else mattered. He ran out of the room wondering how he had done it. Why now? Shihan ran down the street with all his might. It was an excruciatingly long way to his home. He was so eager to experience what he had just felt. He ran and smiled. For the first time in many years, he was filled with joy, as if colors had returned to the world. He had a chance to make things right, a chance to return to Terranor again. Until now, Shihan had not been able to do this because he did not know in which direction the portal needed to be opened in order to get to Terranor. But now the key had been found, in the darkness of the infinite universe, where a swarm of dimensions is incomprehensible to man. A guiding beam of light had been lit. It was the light of Terranor that Shihan could no longer lose, as if asking for the door to be opened. Shihan kept running. Passers-by looked at him, but he didn't care about them. A question came into his head. Why was he so excited? Why was he so eager to check if he had long ago resigned himself and decided to stay on Earth? The certainty that he had forgiven everyone, that the drama of his return was entirely in the past, was fading. It had never been true. All this time he lied to himself because he was crushed by the impossibility of returning. All these years the bitterness of disappointment made him unhappy. Now anger awoke in Shihan and was directed at himself. He cursed himself for folding his arms. All his previous convictions crumbled. He knew that he would seize this chance and do everything to achieve his goal. Shihan dropped out of university, spending all his time training, mastering the art of opening portals and training his fighting abilities. The thought that everything was within his power charged Shihan with energy, and not a trace remained of his former apathy. Finally, 10 years after returning to Earth, the portal to Terranor was opened again. Shihan stood before it and couldn't believe it. He succeeded in this, something beyond the pale. But what awaited him on the other side, no one knew. Shihan began to laugh. What did it matter if he succeeded? What difference did it make what happened next, if he fulfilled his innermost wish? He laughed and welcomed the door to another world. It was the triumph of a hero. Now Shihan has to put everything in its place and return what is due to the savior from another world. The guy woke up and finished the phrase he had started to say to Alita, answering that everything was quite good. He added that he could use magic and combat energy, was able to settle in society, and he decided not to highlight his problems. Alita seemed pleased with this answer and very interested. She had a dreamy look. Shihan was puzzled, trying to guess what his girlfriend was thinking. They started their lesson. It seemed that Shihan was doing a little better in teaching magic, and the day for the lesson was also excellent. Alita sat on her knees, focused on something inside herself, her hands clenched into fists. Shihan asked her what she felt, to which she replied that there was some kind of vague sensation. The guy instructively noted that, knowing the theory, you can't start until you feel what you'll be controlling. He decided to cheer her up and said that she would be able to open portals once she reached the 3rd level of mastery. Alita even opened her eyes in amazement. She asked again if such serious magic was only available at the 3rd level, and Shihan simply confirmed it, since she had already summoned him. After the summoning, she will learn to hide the magical traces that the summoner leaves. This was also not difficult. Shihan said that once she learned to do this, she would no longer need it to disappear from the sight of her pursuers. Alita realized that she would gain complete freedom with little effort. Shihan jokingly added that he would of course ask her not to risk herself until he finished his business. Alita was excited. She stood up from the ground and timidly began to speak. She asked if Shihan wanted her to stay with him on the team and help him achieve his goals. The guy replied that he would certainly be happy about this, since he trusted his friend and she had helped him out more than once. Alita thought about the next question. So far, Shihan's answers were satisfactory. She asked what his plans were after the revenge was completed, where he was going to go, and what he was going to do. More specifically, she wanted to know if Shihan wanted to stay in Terranor like he did 10 years ago. Her friend replied that Terranor had changed a lot, and now he didn't even know what to do. It was as if he had become a stranger in both worlds. Shihan assumed that once he had completed his plan, he would think about where to go next. This time he will probably return home voluntarily, since he really has incredible prospects in his home world. Alita turned to her friend with fear. Some terrible thought overwhelmed her. She asked if she would need to burn someone's heart to return, causing Shihan to startle and categorically object. He replied that it would be easier for him to return home than to get to Terranor. He twirled his finger and a blue discharge flashed. A small portal opened in the air in front of him, and Alita was dumbfounded by surprise. Shihan said that if he opens a random portal from an alien world, it always leads to Earth. And only on Earth do portals lead anywhere. The only thing he doesn't know is where exactly on Earth he will end up. And then Quan Huaman Square appeared before his eyes again. But he had taken care of even that, so there would be no repetition of the past shame, Shihan declared. And Alita thought that he was overreacting. The girl smiled. She was about to say or ask something important. The swordswoman told Shihan that she would go to Earth with him. The guy did not expect such a desire from her. She explained that here she was an eternal exile, the daughter of a tyrant and the object of the hunt. But there, she would have a chance to start over. Shihan looked at her and thought that there was a lot of truth in these words. Alita said that she would help Shihan in his affairs, and in return asked for the opportunity to get to Earth for herself. The girl made her request so passionately that Shihan trembled before her sincerity and beauty. He could not refuse her. In yet another palace of Jacksongard, an idol reigned. Bright birds made melodic trills, sitting in thickets of flowers framing elegant fountains. A beautiful young woman was walking through the park, her fair hair braided into a thick plait that fell over her blue dress. Someone called out to her from behind and asked if she was really walking all alone. It was Prince Ains, and he greeted Queen Layla with a friendly air. Layla was also glad to see him. Her aquamarine eyes were the model from which the fabric for the dress was chosen. The woman radiated pure tenderness and replied that even alone it was pleasant to walk under such a beautiful sky. But Ains added that it was also dangerous. Layla replied that she had nothing to fear, since she was nothing more than a queen, and in fact she played no role in politics. Jacksongard married her for convenience, and after the wedding did not deign to pay her any attention. She was not aware of palace affairs. Layla turned and walked on, but looked back when Ains spoke again. He said that, unlike her father, he was very interested in her, and hugged her from behind, pressing her to himself. Layla gently objected that this was impossible, and that they should not be seen, but she did not resist, allowing herself to be hugged further. Ains replied that he had spoken about walking alone because he had checked the park, and there was definitely no one else there. The prince began to kiss the queen, and she allowed him to continue, melting in his arms. The queen's palace was decorated in blue, the color that distinguished things that had to do with her. After a while, Ains walked down one of the corridors. He walked with a normal gait, but from the front you could see his wariness. Finally, he spoke up for the man who was following him to stop hiding and show himself. Count Celton appeared from behind a column, and Ains asked point-blank what kind of surveillance he had arranged. Celton came closer and replied in a conspiratorial tone that he had some very interesting information for Ains. Shihan put the large pill into his mouth with displeasure. This procedure was always difficult. The product was tasteless with a strong bitterness. Even though it had to be simply swallowed, it managed to leave a mark. Zeno appeared next to the bottle and presented it to Shihan, saying that it was a sauce that he had made specifically to make the medicine easier to take. While Shihan was praising Zenon because the sauce really made the taste good, Alita thought that she had literally felt the effect in just one day. These were special pills that increased fighting energy and were used specifically for training. They now had large stocks of the stuff thanks to Count Celton's money and connections. Shihan was very pleased. In the new circumstances, his strength grew by leaps and bounds. He had already reached the level of a master. This speed of recovery made the fight with Jacksongard ever closer. He already saw his enemy in front of him and was anticipating sweet retribution. But Celton and Shihan's communication turned upside down once they met at the Count's mansion. The maid reported on the arrival of the mercenary Sean. Shirkan stood in the doorway and peered into the half-open door. Celton became indignant and began to scold Shihan for being late, which was unacceptable. He demanded that he stop hesitating and come in, and ordered the maids to get out. They, fearing the master's anger, immediately disappeared. Shihan looked at the closed door in surprise, and Celton exhaled tensely. The Count immediately began to bow to his secret master. It seemed that he was not at ease playing out such scenes. Shihan looked at this performance and thought what a dramatic change had occurred in the blink of an eye. He said the Count was playing perfectly, and it was impossible to tell from the outside when he wasn't pretending. Celton said he was just maintaining cover. Shihan actually wanted to see the Count himself. He asked how things were going with his request. Celton took out from a hidden place and showed a list with a number of names that Shihan had asked for. These are people who, according to Celton's information, are not particularly loyal to the current government and would be ready to support a coup. He suggested that if they openly confronted Jacksongard, Shihan would most likely succeed, but the other 5 emperors would immediately unite. If the operation is carried out covertly, and it is made to appear as if the citizens themselves overthrew their ruler, it will not arouse anyone's suspicions. Shihan was amazed at how quickly Celton had renounced the one he served, but he was concerned that the list was not very long. There were few dissatisfied people. At the same time, Jacksongard relied on the army. The Order of the Black Lion and the militia of 30,000 infantrymen constituted a great force. Of course, Shihan already knew that some of the knights had their own interests, since they carried out their operations on behalf of the Blue Tower without anyone's knowledge. Sheehan said that they needed to deal with that part of the elite that formed the loyal backbone of Jacksonguard's power, and asked who led them. Keltron raised his hand with a satisfied look and said that this figure was him. Sheehan saw the plan as risky. He liked it. But something was missing. It was only necessary to decide how to get rid of some difficulties and dangers. Keltron said that one thing was troubling him. Sheehan listened, as the Count was more knowledgeable in intrigue. Keltron said that Prince Ainz, on whom they had decided to bet, did not respect him at all, and without authority it would be difficult to convince him. A little earlier they had a dialogue. They moved from the corridor into a closed room. When Ainz listened to the Count, he did not believe that he was a traitor. Keltron sat in the chair and with all his appearance expressed humility and sincerity, but Ainz considered him a fake and assumed that this was another trick. He said that Keltron was too close to the Emperor and had too much of him to overthrow him. Keltron couldn't say that he had an even more powerful patron. He had to convince the prince in other ways. But Ainz didn't think Keltron's arguments about the country going into decline were worth anything to him, so he wanted to know the motive. Keltron decided to act differently, his expression becoming cunning to match what he was about to say. The Count agreed that he was simply a parasite who used power for personal enrichment, and that is why he must ensure that this state is preserved, and it is threatened with destruction if Jacksonguard is not removed. Ainz was troubled by this statement and wanted to know why Keltron made this decision. The prince stated that such statements could not be made lightly, to which Keltron replied that he was ready to put his life on the line. The Count said that he was primarily concerned about himself, but he began the conversation with the poor, since a change in power would help them too. Keltron said he was even willing to lose some of his wealth if he knew he would live a long life with it, instead of falling from the heights to the bottom. Ainz countered that Jacksonguard was young and powerful, so why would he lose power and country? Keltron said that Prince Ainz was smart and therefore knew the answer to this question himself. The kingdom played a bad role in the Kagon War, so as soon as Lilstay or Ignatius get a chance, they will remove this piece from the board. Unfortunately, by dividing power, the six friends did not strengthen their friendship, but destroyed it. So if one of them leaves the game, it will become safer. Keltron understood that if the government changed, he would have to play up his concern for the people under the new ruler, but he was used to it. Ainz countered that if a coup occurred, Keltron would still be in danger. The prince said he had no intention of encouraging this lying upstart if he got power. He suggested that he would deprive him of all his money. So he asked what would be the benefit to Keltron if he no longer had his privileges. The Count closed his eyes, gathering all the persuasiveness he had. He replied that he was most effective in ensuring the outcome, whether the king wanted the good of the poor or personal wealth. Jacksonguard wished for luxury, and Keltron provided him with luxury. If the prince answered what he wished, Keltron would also fulfill it. Ainz jumped up in anger. This cynical bribery was not to his liking, like making a deal with the devil for a good cause. Keltron decided he had said enough and also stood up from the table. Keeping his cool, the Count walked away while the prince continued to stand there, holding back his anger. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that the Count had stopped right at the door and had not opened it. Keltron said that this woman was the queen. At these words, the prince's eyes widened. He wondered where this man found out everything. Keltron added that, to be precise, it was the king's woman, and the prince looked at his back furiously, ready to pounce. He asked Keltron what he was hinting at. Ainz wanted to stop these damn games. Keltron turned around with a smile. He had found what he was looking for. Now the prince was ready to listen to him. The Count explained that the queen would not go to Jacksonguard. She would go to the king, whoever he might be. It was a quiet afternoon in the Keltron mansion, with birds singing in the surrounding garden and a cool breeze blowing. After returning from the Count, Sheehan settled down on the sofa to immerse himself in reading. He enjoyed the opportunity to let his eyes wander leisurely over the lines, but the rest was not destined to take place. A sudden roar and scream were heard from the street. Sheehan rushed down and opened the doors of the house leading to the garden, looking around to see what had happened. There was Alida, confused, guilty, and scared at the same time. She could only call her friend for help. Zeno lay nearby, thrown to the ground, still covered in flames in places. It looked like the knight had received a powerful blow. Friends called Zeno, hoping that he would come to his senses. Their cries echoed throughout the garden and frightened the birds. Sheehan shook his comrade, hoping that it would help him wake up. Alida stood guiltily to the side, although there was a drop of admiration for herself in her. Sheehan wanted to know how this happened, and the girl began to tell him. Zeno was tending spinach in the garden. The beds with beautiful, neat bushes were pleasing to the eye. The knight took up gardening with gusto, and soon he was planning to harvest. Alita was practicing magic a little further away. It had been about a month since she started doing it. She opened the spell book and decided to try casting one for the first time as a test. What Shihan showed her seemed simple enough to be able to do it the first time. She began to repeat the necessary actions. A faint glow began to emanate from her hands, and streams of fire flowed out of nowhere into her palms. But the result exceeded expectations. A wind blew from Alita, lifting leaves into the air. A whole fiery whirlwind fluttered in her hands, lashing the ground around with fiery streams. The girl realized that she could not hold this magical clot. Zeno only had time to turn around and ask what was happening to Alita. She called out to him cautiously, but the fire shot out towards him faster than a human could react. Luckily, the huge fireball didn't hit the guy, but it did hit his favorite garden beds. The explosion was so powerful that Zeno was thrown back and fell to the ground unconscious. Alita said that she tried to divert the fire, but all she managed to do was shift the ball's flight by a couple of meters. Zenon, who had already woken up, examined the destroyed beds and lamented that he should have been in their place. It seemed the guy was not hurt. Alita felt ashamed and said that next time she would aim specifically at Zenon, to which Shihan remarked that one could aim at the sky. He examined the impact site and concluded that it did not look like first-tier magic, and then asked if Alita had actually used that spell. He asked her to try again so that she could see with her own eyes how it happened. The girl was already a little afraid, but again began to concentrate magic using the language of runes. Shihan watched in amazement as the magic gathered around her in a dense stream. He stopped her before she even started casting the spell. Shihan was impressed by what was happening. It seemed like this was not what he expected at all when he suggested that she study. He told her that the amount of magic she concentrated was equivalent to a 5th or even 7th level mage. Zenon asked in surprise how this happened, since she had only just started. To which Shihan replied that although it was hard to believe, it was true. Alita asked to explain to her what was happening to her and her witchcraft. Shihan said that magicians take energy from the surrounding nature, and when they create a spell, a 5th or even a 10th of this energy remains. But when Alita does the same thing, the amount of energy not only doesn't decrease, it increases. This would only be possible if there was some additional source that added energy. Lilstay or Saffron knew anything about it. Alita asked if she would then be able to continue studying, to which the guy replied that the risks had increased greatly and she should stop. The girl was upset by this and asked again if she'd understood correctly that a very great power was hidden within her. And if so, how could she possibly refuse this power if it could be used? Shihan thought that Alita was a risky girl. He wanted to protect her, but she herself seemed to not want it. If so, he had another solution for this issue for his girlfriend. Shihan admitted that there is a second way in which she does not have to stop practicing. He said that he once overcame a similar problem due to the fact that Earthlings absorb more energy from nature than the Terranors. Alita was glad. Now she knew that excessive magic power was not a death sentence. Shihan said that he would try to teach her to control her excess energy, but this was fraught with great risks. Without hesitation, Alita agreed, because having barely tried magic, she was no longer ready to give it up. Keltron's office was already becoming familiar to Shihan. He closed the door tightly behind him, as usual, taking precautions. Servants had a habit of sticking their noses into other people's business. Keltron was radiating hospitality as he greeted Shihan and invited him to sit down opposite him. Shihan came to find out how the negotiations with Ains were progressing. Keltron replied that the prince had thawed out somewhat and was looking at the plan with interest. But he put forward counter-conditions. He wants guarantees of reliability so that it doesn't turn out that Keltron is not acting seriously. Shihan said that it was predictable, so he was just curious about what kind of proof the prince wanted. Keltron responded that Ains wished to eliminate one of the so-called 3 faithful dogs of Jacksongard. The emperor had 3 trusted men to whom he delegated all government control. They ran the army, the economy, and politics. The army was led by Master Berkeley, the head of the Black Lion Knights, whom Shihan had the opportunity to meet. The economy was managed by the emperor's father-in-law, the richest man in the country, Count Kramaton. Shihong asked, "Who is the last dog who determines the kingdom's policies?" Keltron raised his hand with a satisfied expression and said that this figure was him. Shihan felt a sense of déjà vu. Keltron said that their target was Master Berkeley, the mainstay of Jacksongard's military force. Shihan asked if this meant he was being asked to fight him, and Keltron expressed his confidence that Shihan would defeat him with one hand. Sheehan was flattered by this, but since he had to do without techniques that could give him away, the task was not easy and required more information. Keltron said that Sheehan actually knows a lot about Berkeley. He was just misled by the fact that he changed his name to a new one. In fact, this man was known during the time of the former emperor as Dartwald, the first assault commander of the army of Jacksonguard. Somewhere far from the capital, another construction project was underway, which Jacksonguard loved to start so much. A fortress was being erected to defend the borders. The merciless guards continued to urge the workers to work faster. He got carried away and threatened to kill someone else to motivate the others, but the workers only looked around sullenly. A sharp blow from a man who appeared nearby knocked the guard to the ground and knocked the air out of his lungs. The man was armed. Such a clear display of disobedience could only mean one thing. It was a riot. The face of the leader of the rebellion was disfigured by a scar. The workers let out an inspired cry and began to gather around him. The guards grabbed their weapons and prepared for the most radical actions. The workers pulled out hidden weapons and a scuffle ensued. The confrontation was bloody. Master Berkeley was informed that a rebellion had begun at the construction site. Berkeley shrugged and replied that the guards themselves could deal with the rabble. The messenger objected that among them there seemed to be a former knight, and therefore the guards could not cope. Berkeley whispered contemptuously that the man seemed to have lost the last of his honor. He stood up and walked towards the battlefield, deciding to deal with the traitor himself. The guards fell under the knight's blows. Even now, when he was no longer in shape, he was still much more dangerous than them. The scarred man cut a path through Jacksonguard's slaves to free them. He called on the guards to leave, as he did not want any more casualties. After all, among them could be those with whom he had once fought side by side. One of the guards actually recognized him. The name of Captain Delart was heard. He was a master swordsman, and the guards were no match for him. Here, Delart saw that among them there was someone who was not in a hurry to retreat to a safe place, but was moving towards him. The guards saw Master Berkeley walking among them, heading towards the leader of the rebellion. The master shouted to the guards who had retreated in indecision before their former comrade to return to the ranks and carry out the emperor's order. Coming within a few steps, Berkeley smiled and greeted Delart, drawing his sword from its sheath. Delart turned to the master. He called him Dartwald, and sadness appeared on his face. The master said that the name no longer applied to him, and asked why Delart was here if he had become a farmer and retired. Delart replied that he had been mistaken in thinking that the fighting was over, but that the new order had forced him to stand up for the oppressed again as before. Berkeley shouted mockingly that Delart was no longer a knight. He was a farmer, and farmers had no honor, but now he wanted to fall lower and become a traitor. Delart clenched his teeth in anger. This man dared to say anything more about betrayal. He shouted, "What kind of knightly honor is the master talking about here, when people die from backbreaking labor for the enrichment of nobles?" Berkeley replied that it was not a knight's job to reason, but to carry out the orders of his master and remain faithful at any cost. Delart asked Dartwald whether it was necessary to overthrow the old emperor for this reason. The magus flushed and pulled his sword aside, demanding that his old name no longer be spoken. Berkeley said that he had the one that the emperor had given him, and jumping up from his seat, the master attacked the enemy. Delart did not expect such a furious attack, and until the very end he believed that his old brother would not dare to do such a thing. Berkeley approached menacingly, his sword pointed towards Delart, ready to strike when the distance was sufficient. Their swords crossed and yellow bolts of combat energy danced around them. Delart immediately felt the enemy's power. It was like being crushed by a rock. Even though they were of the same rank, Delart already understood that he would not be able to defeat the Knightmaster. He stood in a deep defense, and Berkeley showered him with a hail of blows, each of which took away his strength.